Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little darker, a little less chocolate and roses, and a lot more messed up than your average rom-com. We're cracking open a topic that's been glamorized, sanitized and sugar-coated for centuries. Romance. But not the fairy tale version. Nope. We're talking about the real stuff. The manipulation, the obsession, the curses and the bloodshed that history quietly tucked under lace veils and love letters. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if you go in expecting hearts and happy endings. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, just spooky, seductive peer pressure. Also, drop your city and what time it is in the comments. I want to know how close to midnight we're getting right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with a face you probably know. Little wings, chubby cheeks, a golden bow, Cupid. You've seen him every February. He's supposed to be the adorable god of love, floating around in diapers, shooting arrows that make people fall head over heels. But here's the catch. Cupid was never meant to be cute. He was chaos with feathers. In ancient Roman mythology, Cupid, known originally as Eros in Greek myth, wasn't just a matchmaking toddler, he was a weapon. Imagine this. You're walking through a sunlit Athenian market buying figs and bam! Suddenly you're hopelessly in love with someone you've never met. You ditch your family, your job, your goat herd. You obsess, you spiral. All because a moody winged boy god felt like messing with you. The ancient Greeks didn't see love as this warm, fuzzy force. They saw it as a form of divine madness. Eros's arrows didn't create healthy relationships. They created passion so intense it often ruined lives. One of the earliest stories about Cupid, or rather Eros, involves him being ordered by his mum, Aphrodite, to make a woman fall in love with a monster. That's right. The goddess of beauty wanted to punish a mortal named Psyche for being too attractive, so she sent her mischievous son to do the dirty work. But plot twist, Cupid saw Psyche, panicked, and accidentally shot himself. Suddenly he was the one obsessed. It's like your mum telling you to catfish someone and you end up simping instead. Classic. This story, which ends with trials, betrayal, a descent into the underworld, and a very awkward family reunion on Mount Olympus, is often told as a tale of true love. But when you break it down, it's just one long toxic entanglement wrapped in divine pettiness. Cupid hides Psyche away in a palace and forbids her from seeing his face. She's basically gaslit into thinking that looking at him will destroy everything. That's not a love story. That's a hostage situation with nice landscaping. Here's a fringe fact most people miss. Early depictions of Eros weren't childlike at all. He was often shown as a slender, dangerous-looking teen boy with sharp wings and a knowing smile. Kind of like if Timothée Chalamet were weaponized by the gods. Over time, artists softened his image, turned him into a harmless cherub to make the concept of love more marketable. You know, less emotional manipulation, more Valentine's Day cupcake toppers. But this shift wasn't random. The Roman Empire, which basically invented the PR campaign for gods, rebranded Eros into Cupid during a period when love started to be romanticized rather than feared. Still, the roots never disappeared. The ancient world knew that love could burn down empires, start wars, and twist the minds of even the most rational humans. That's why Cupid wasn't just a god. He was a warning. There's still scholarly debate about whether Cupid Eros was meant to be portrayed as malicious or merely immoral. Some historians argue that he symbolizes the natural chaos of desire, which can't be judged as good or bad. Others believe that his presence in myths, especially ones that end badly, suggest that ancient writers knew exactly how destructive romantic obsession could be. Either way, the consensus is clear. He's no innocent baby with a bow. He's love personified. And love, historically, has a pretty gnarly track record. And this isn't just metaphorical. Remember the Trojan War? That 10-year bloodbath started because Paris fell in love with Helen, who was already married, because Aphrodite promised her to him. The gods didn't just let humans fall in love, they engineered it, often as revenge, political maneuvering, or divine games. Cupid was their tool, a beautiful, glittery syringe of madness. So, next time you see that grinning cherub plastered on pink candy wrappers, maybe take a second. Look past the soft curls and golden arrows. Remember the version that snuck into myths like a smiling assassin. the version that taught mortals that love isn't always kind. Sometimes it's a trickster god with commitment issues and a very questionable sense of humour. As you drift off tonight, just imagine this. What if falling in love wasn't a choice you made, but a fate decided by an immortal toddler with no impulse control? What if everything you ever felt, every crush, every heartbreak, every breathless, irrational, can't-sleep kind of longing, was someone else's prank? That's the romantic origin story you weren't supposed to know. And guess what? We're just getting started. Now that you've got a clearer picture of love's original brand ambassador being more chaos gremlin than cherub, let's swirl the potion a little deeper. Tonight, we're peeking into humanity's centuries-long obsession with forcing love. Literally. Before dating apps and flirty emojis, people had one go-to strategy for finding affection. The love potion. Sounds dreamy, right? A few drops of magic, one bat of the eyelashes, and boom, they're yours. Except, not really. The first love potion was less a romantic shortcut and more a shortcut to disaster. So picture this. You're a peasant girl in 12th century France. The baker's son never looks your way. You're desperate, frustrated, maybe a little hormonal. Okay, a lot hormonal. And then, like divine timing, a travelling wise woman offers you a solution. Just a vial of rose-tinted syrup. Whisper his name while stirring it into his ale, and he'll love you forever. That's the promise. But what's in the vial? Oh, nothing much. Maybe a little wolf's bane, some crushed beetles, powdered bone, a splash of opium, and hey, let's toss in a toad's liver for good luck. Now imagine the baker's son drinks it, and either he falls head over heels, or he projectile vomits and dies in the street. Because that's the thing no one told you. Medieval love potions were basically poison in a cute bottle. Love, back then, was chemistry in the most literal and most dangerous sense. Herbalists, alchemists, and witches brewed thousands of variations of these infatuation elixirs, but most of them worked through toxic ingredients that altered the drinker's physical state. In other words, love potions were less about emotion and more about messing with your body until you couldn't think straight. Here's the kicker. These brews were popular with everyone from commoners to queens. Entire court scandals bloomed around the suspicion of love spells. In Italy during the Renaissance, women were known to hide concoctions inside chocolates or wines to seduce noblemen. In England, it became so widespread that Parliament actually had to pass laws making it illegal to bewitch the affections of another, which in plain English means, please stop slipping people weird stuff to make them like you. One of the most infamous cases was in the 17th century France, where a woman named Catherine Monvoisin, also known as La Voisin, ran a side hustle selling potions, poisons and black masses to wealthy Parisians. Her bestsellers? Custom love potions and problem removers, aka discreet poisons for when love potions didn't work and you just needed the guy gone. She had an entire underground network that included priests and nobility. When authorities finally shut her down, they found human remains in her garden. And yes, she had clients inside King Louis XIV's inner circle. Love, at this level, wasn't just a dangerous game, it was an industry. So here's a little-known quirky fact. One common ingredient in ancient love potions was Spanish fly. Despite the name, it's not romantic, and it's definitely not Spanish. It's a crushed beetle that contains cantharidin, a chemical that causes irritation, inflammation, and sometimes hallucinations. The theory was that it would increase arousal. What it actually did was cause blisters, fever, and organ failure. But hey, in the name of love, right? Of course, not everyone believed in these potions. There were skeptics, early physicians, religious leaders, and people who didn't want to die from kissing. But here's the fascinating part. Even the doubters often acted like the potions worked. Why? Because blaming a love spell was a convenient excuse. Got caught having an affair? Clearly it was a potion. Murdered your husband? He was bewitched. Fell in love with someone completely inappropriate for your station or gender or religion. Magic, obviously. The potion myth gave people a loophole, a way to explain choices society didn't approve of. That's where the scholarly debate comes in. Historians still argue, were love potions genuinely believed to be magical, or were they always just psychological tools? Did people think they were conjuring Cupid in a bottle, or were they using it to feel more confident? Some believed the real power was in the ritual, the stirring, the whispering, the secrecy, like a placebo with a little extra drama. Others argue that these substances did alter behaviour, If not through real affection, then through the powerful effects of drugs, hunger, and stress. Think about how love feels. Dizzying, sweaty, heart-pounding. Now think about what a mild dose of belladonna or wormwood does to the nervous system. See the connection? What's most chilling is how often these potions were used without consent. The idea of giving someone a drink to bend their will seems romanticised in fairy tales, but it was, and is, deeply manipulative. That element of control, of ownership, has always lived under love's prettier names. These old-world love brews weren't about mutual affection. They were about dominance, about taking what wasn't freely given and labelling it destiny. Even today, echoes of that thinking survive. From songs about can't help falling in love, to movies where someone lies or stalks their way into someone's heart, it's all just modern spellwork dressed in better lighting. The love potion didn't disappear, it just got rebranded. So, next time you hear the phrase "he was under her spell," remember, it might not be metaphor. There's centuries of history where love was less about chemistry and more about actual chemistry, spiced with manipulation, mixed in secrecy, and served cold, preferably with a lock of hair and a whispered curse. Sleep tight knowing that someone somewhere once tried to bottle affection, and what they got instead was madness in a glass. You're already 2 sections deep, and romance probably feels a little less like a candlelit dinner and a little more like a medieval fever dream. Good. That's the vibe. Because tonight the illusions keep crumbling, and now we're taking a detour into Egypt, a hot, heady land of gold, blood, politics, and, oh yeah, Cleopatra. That name alone is a whole aesthetic. Seductive, cunning, tragic, maybe even iconic. But here's the part history textbooks tend to gloss over. Cleopatra's love life wasn't just dramatic, it was fatal. And not just for her. Let's set the scene. Cleopatra the 7th Philopator, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, wasn't just the Queen of the Nile. She was a survivor born into a web of incest, betrayal, and civil war. Imagine growing up in a palace where family dinners came with the constant threat of assassination. Now imagine using romance not as an escape, but as your most powerful weapon. That was Cleopatra's game, and it worked, until it didn't. Her most famous relationships, first with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony, have been immortalised as love stories. But here's the gritty truth. They were deeply political, highly strategic, and soaked in blood. Julius Caesar, the ultimate Roman power player, didn't just fall for Cleopatra because of her beauty, which, by the way, wasn't even described as exceptional by her contemporaries. He saw her as an asset. Egypt was rich in grain, and Cleopatra offered both charm and economic leverage, their so-called romance. It began with Cleopatra sneaking herself into Caesar's palace rolled up in a carpet. Cute. But the reason she did it was because her brother was trying to kill her. Once they were entangled, things escalated fast. Cleopatra gave birth to Caesar's son, Caesarion, and for a while, it seemed like she might ride that connection all the way to Rome's throne. But then Caesar was stabbed 23 times by his own Senate in the theatre of Pompey, and suddenly Cleopatra's Roman dreams were splattered on marble floors. Enter Mark Antony, charming, reckless, fond of theatrics and wine. When he met Cleopatra, she arrived by barge dressed as the goddess Isis, dripping in pearls and perfume, with musicians trailing behind her. Not subtle, but that's how she played. Full spectacle. Antony was smitten, or maybe just completely outmatched. They became lovers, yes, but also allies in an escalating Cold War against Caesar's heir, Octavian. Here's the weird fact. Cleopatra and Antony didn't just love each other. They played house on a scale so dramatic, it makes modern celebrity power couples look like sock puppets. They formed their own mini-kingdom in Alexandria, held Dionysian feasts, called themselves living gods, and literally divided up the Eastern Roman territories like party favours for their children. They weren't just in bed together, they were trying to remake the world. Of course, Octavian, later Augustus Caesar, wasn't exactly thrilled about all this. He launched a smear campaign so effective that it shaped how we view Cleopatra to this day. He painted her as a manipulative temptress who bewitched poor Antony into betraying Rome. In reality, Antony made his own choices, many of them deeply questionable. But blaming the foreign queen made the whole mess more palatable for Roman audiences. It all came crashing down in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was crushed. Cleopatra fled. Antony, thinking she was dead, fell on his sword in a botched suicide attempt. He didn't die right away, it took hours, and he was carried bleeding into her tomb where he died in her arms. Romantic? Maybe. Tragic? Definitely. Avoidable? Also, yes. A year later, Cleopatra followed. No one knows for certain how she died. The legend says she let a venomous asp bite her. Other theories suggest poison hidden in a hairpin or delivered in a vial. Either way, it was the end of her, and the end of Egypt's independence. Octavian annexed the kingdom, killed her son Caesarion, and became Rome's first emperor. All that love, all that fire, all that plotting, extinguished with a whisper. There's still debate among historians about whether Cleopatra truly loved Antony, or Caesar for that matter. Some argue she was a master manipulator who used intimacy as a tool of diplomacy. Others suggest genuine affection, noting the years she spent with Antony, the children they had together, the devastation at his death. Maybe it was both. Love and politics, after all, have always been inseparable at the highest levels of power. But one thing is certain. Their love didn't save them. It doomed them. It started wars, broke alliances, and brought down dynasties. That's the not-so-glamorous side of their story. While Shakespeare gave us flowery speeches and swooning deaths, the real version involves propaganda, and oh, did I mention propaganda? Cleopatra's downfall wasn't just personal. It was weaponized as a cautionary tale about women who get too powerful, about love that dares to challenge empires. And here's your fun fringe twist. There's evidence that Octavian kept Cleopatra's private diaries. Some scholars believe he used her own words to frame the narrative that she was a lust-driven manipulator, meaning the history you've heard might be ghost-written by her greatest enemy. That's the kind of post-breakup energy you can only find in ancient Rome. So tonight, as you drift off, remember this. Even the most iconic love stories are full of shadows. Behind every grand romantic gesture, there's often a trail of bodies and a heap of bad decisions. Cleopatra didn't just fall in love, she weaponized it. But when love becomes a battlefield, someone always loses, and more often than not, it's everyone. If you're still with me, eyes heavy, thoughts turning, we're about to slip into the metal and misery phase of romance history. Tonight's dark little corner, chastity belts. Ah yes, the infamous locked underwear of medieval legend. You've seen the cartoons, knights off to war, wives literally padlocked in iron undergarments to keep their virtue safe. It's both hilarious and horrifying. But here's the thing. The story you think you know about chastity belts? Yeah, it's probably wrong, and the truth is somehow even weirder. Let's start with the basics. The chastity belt is often imagined as this iron contraption, heavy, clunky, and fitted with jagged teeth to say, keep out, in the least romantic way possible. Supposedly, men in the Middle Ages would strap these devices onto their wives before heading out on crusade, locking their loyalty in place for years while they gallivanted around the Holy Land. That's the myth, and it's got some serious staying power. But here's the historical buzzkill. Almost all of those metal belts you've seen in museums, they're fakes, Victorian-era props, made hundreds of years after the fact. Actual evidence of chastity belts being worn during the Middle Ages is shaky at best. Most references to them are satirical or metaphorical. Think 15th century Italian poetry mocking jealous husbands, or woodcuts with more symbolism than realism. The first real examples don't pop up until the Renaissance, and even then, it's debated whether they were ever used for real-life control or just novelty items meant to poke fun at the idea of female virtue as property. But while the physical belts might be mostly myth, the idea behind them, oh, that was painfully real. This was a time when a woman's virginity wasn't just a personal matter, it was economic and political currency. Families traded daughters in marriage deals, and those deals came with very strict expectations. A pure bride meant alliances could be forged, dowries paid in full, and reputations preserved. Love had nothing to do with it. It was all about control, surveillance, and the constant threat of punishment. And let's not forget, it wasn't just unmarried women being watched like hawks. Married women were expected to be obedient, modest, and above all, chaste. Chastity wasn't just about virginity. It was a lifelong performance of purity, silence, and submission. Any deviation from that ideal, scandal, shame, sometimes stoning, sometimes worse. And here's your weird fringe fact. In some towns there were actual chastity inspectors. No joke. In 16th century Venice, there were reports of matrons whose job it was to examine young women before marriage to ensure their virginity was intact. Let that sink in. Your future might depend on some older stranger giving your anatomy the bureaucratic thumbs up. Romance, right? This obsession with female purity infected everything from church sermons to medical textbooks. People genuinely believed that a woman's morality was housed in her womb. If she had sex outside of marriage, it would literally warp her body, make her eyes dim, her skin pale, her uterus wander. Yes, wandering womb syndrome was a real medical theory, and it basically blamed all female problems on not being married and having babies. Feeling anxious? Hysteria? Fainting spells? Must be your womb missing the sweet call of lawful matrimony. How did they fix it? Oh, you know. Leech therapy, forced confinement, herbal sedatives. Because nothing says love like treating a woman's autonomy like a contagious disease. There's ongoing scholarly debate about whether chastity belts were ever mass used, or if the whole idea was a grotesque joke blown out of proportion by later generations. Some historians say the few surviving belts were more like theatrical warnings, maybe even fetish objects, believe it or not. Others argue that even if the metal belts weren't widespread, society had plenty of invisible ones, social codes, religious dogma, legal structures that effectively locked women up just the same. And it wasn't just women. Young men, especially in religious orders, were also subjected to strict codes of sexual purity. Monks wore cilices, spiked chains under their robes, to discipline their desires. Some even went as far as wearing literal cages or punishing themselves at night with whips to beat lust out of their systems. All in the name of love, or rather, the complete absence of it. Romance? Not tonight, Satan. But let's circle back to the image of the knight and the chastity belt, because it's more than just a myth. It's a mirror. The idea that a man could lock up a woman's body, her desire, her freedom, and then ride off with the key, that's not just about iron. That's about power. About ownership disguised as affection. And it didn't stay in the past, it evolved into laws that control reproductive rights, into purity culture, into the lingering belief that a person's value can be measured by what they haven't done. The chastity belt may not have clanged around Europe for centuries, but its ghost is everywhere. And here's the twisted punchline. Some companies today make modern chastity belts. For fidelity games, they say. Stainless steel, fully lockable. Some even come with Bluetooth. You can control it with your phone. Progress, baby. So as you tuck yourself in tonight, consider this. In the grand theatre of romance history, people have always tried to regulate love. Who gets it, who deserves it, and who gets locked out. The tools change. The message doesn't. You're still here, brave, or maybe just too curious to look away like someone watching a slow-motion carriage crash, but make it historical and drenched in perfume. So far, we've met love gods who ruin lives, deadly potions disguised as devotion, and belts built more for fear than function. But tonight, we're wandering into a candlelit hall full of poetry, music, and sighing noble women. Courtly love. Sounds nice, right? Soft lute music, fluttering hearts, knights writing sonnets. Except, surprise, it wasn't romantic. Not really. Courtly love was just emotional manipulation dressed up in velvet. Let's set the scene. It's 12th century France. Castles, tournaments, troubadours. You're a noble woman with a husband you didn't choose and zero legal rights. Your main hobbies include embroidery and not dying in childbirth. Then one day a knight arrives at court. He's tall, brooding, good with sword, and has a horse that costs more than your dowry. He bows, he compliments your eyes, he writes you a poem. Suddenly you feel something like freedom. Except, it isn't. Not really. Because this whole system of courtly love was less about empowering women and more about creating a socially acceptable form of obsession. Courtly love, or fin amour, was a set of unspoken rules that governed how noble men could express adoration, usually toward a married, socially superior woman they had no chance of actually being with. It was love without consummation, or at least that's what the rules said. The knight pines, he suffers, he performs brave deeds to prove his loyalty. Meanwhile, the lady gives him just enough attention to keep him hooked, but not enough to destroy her reputation. It's emotional breadcrumbing, medieval style. The classic example, Lancelot and Guinevere. He's King Arthur's most loyal knight, and she's the queen. Their forbidden love is the stuff of legend, but let's be honest, it's also the slow-motion death of the Round Table. Lancelot literally goes mad at one point because of his love for her. The kingdom falls, the dream dies, and people still swoon over it. Here's the twisted core. Courtly love pretended to worship women. The man calls her his muse, his angel, his salvation. But it's never really about her. It's about his suffering, his desire, his story. She becomes an object to long for, not a person with agency. Sound familiar? One quirky little detail. Some troubadours believed that the more pain a man felt, the more noble his love was. Like, the deeper your emotional spiral, the more poetic your soul. There were actual handbooks about how to pine correctly, how often to cry, how many stanzas to write, how to accept rejection with grace. But still, linger dramatically. The goal wasn't to be loved back. The goal was to ache beautifully. And yeah, it got weird. Some knights would wear their beloved's undergarments into battle. Others would refuse to eat or sleep, claiming they were lovesick. This wasn't just metaphor. Lovesickness was considered a genuine medical condition. Doctors diagnosed it, prescribed for it. Some treatments included herbs, bleeding, or being sent on long walks to clear your head, because nothing says romance like a little medieval bloodletting. But for all its theatrics, courtly love was also a pressure cooker. Women were expected to play along without stepping out of line. If a lady gave in too much, she was shamed. Too little, and she was cold. The line between object of desire and object of scandal was razor thin. Even queens weren't safe. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of her age, was rumoured to have fostered a court of love, where noblewomen judged romantic disputes like a panel of medieval bachelorettes. Historians now believe it was probably exaggerated, if not entirely fictional, but the idea stuck because people wanted to believe that women's hearts could be a battlefield too. And here's the scholarly debate. Was courtly love a real social practice, or just poetic fantasy? Some historians argue that it was mostly literary, a set of tropes passed around by bored aristocrats with too much ink and not enough privacy. Others insist it shaped actual behaviour in courts across Europe, influencing how people navigated marriage, flirtation, and social status. Either way, the emotional manipulation was very real, whether acted out or just written about. Because let's not forget the stakes. These weren't harmless love notes. If a married woman was caught in a romantic entanglement, even a poetic one, it could end in ruin. Loss of status, public humiliation, accusations of adultery, which could lead to imprisonment, exile, even death. One noblewoman, Marguerite de Bourgogne, was imprisoned in a castle tower for years after being accused of an affair. All because someone else found her courtly letters. Paper trails in the Middle Ages were just as dangerous as they are now, and yet, despite all this danger, people kept playing the game. Why? Because it gave them something. In a world where marriages were arranged and affection was optional, courtly love created a space for longing, for fantasy, for the illusion that passion still existed, even if it had to be lived in secret or only on parchment. So as you drift off tonight, imagine this. A knight standing under a stone balcony, whispering poems to a woman who can never answer. He'll ride into battle in her name. He'll fight. He'll bleed. He'll write 1,000 verses. And she'll keep her silence, her mask of virtue, and the knowledge that her heart is not hers to give. Romance, in the end, was just another performance. Well-dressed, well-versed, and full of soft, miserable lies. You're getting pretty deep into this now, and at this point romance should be looking less like a bouquet of roses and more like a thorn bush that bites back. But we're not done yet. Tonight, we head into the dark forests of fear, suspicion, and fire. We're talking about how forbidden love, jealousy, and good old-fashioned moral panic fueled one of the deadliest episodes in history, the witch trials. Because plot twist, witches weren't always burned for casting curses or turning milk sour. Sometimes the real accusation was love gone wrong. Imagine it. A quiet village, maybe somewhere in early modern Europe, Salem, Scotland, Bavaria. You're a woman who's had a lover leave you. Or you're a midwife who helped the wrong girl with the wrong kind of secret. Or maybe you just make really great herbal tea and a guy gets a little too obsessed after drinking it. Suddenly, you're not a healer. You're not a widow. You're not just a lonely soul with a sharp tongue. No, now you're a witch. Because in a world terrified of female sexuality, agency and independence, There's no scarier thing than a woman men can't control. It sounds dramatic, but seriously, love and lust were central players in many witch trials. Take the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the 15th century witch hunting manual, written by two very uptight German inquisitors. This delightful little book claimed that witches seduced men, stole their virility, and could manipulate desire with a mere glance. Women, it said, were more susceptible to demonic temptation because they were weaker in faith and naturally lascivious. Translation: if a man couldn't control himself, clearly it was the woman's fault, and obviously she had help from Satan. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In some cases, men accused women of witchcraft because they rejected them. As in, she said no to my proposal, so clearly she hexed my crops. In one French village, a man claimed his former lover cursed him with impotence. This was treated not as tragic immaturity, but as legal grounds for a full-blown witch trial, because nothing says romantic revenge like tying someone to a stake because they didn't text back. It gets worse. Some women were accused of bewitching married men, usually by those men's wives. If a husband strayed or became obsessed with another woman, it was more socially acceptable to believe he'd been ensnared by evil than to admit he was just a sleaze. In this way, the witch trials became an outlet for jealousy, shame, and the failure of arranged marriages. Women turned against women, trying to explain away their own heartbreak or betrayal by pointing fingers at the nearest convenient scapegoat. And for women on the margins, widows, midwives, herbalists, unmarried women over 30, just existing was suspicious. If you weren't someone's daughter, wife, or mother, your mere presence raised eyebrows. Why wasn't anyone claiming you? Who did you belong to? And if the answer was no one, then clearly you were up to something. The logic was simple and brutal. Unclaimed women had power. Power had to be feared. And fear led to fire. Salem, 1692. You probably know the story. Hysteria, teenage girls screaming, people hanged because someone dreamed about them. But what gets left out is how often romantic entanglements played a role. Some historians believe that Abigail Williams, one of the key accusers, had an inappropriate relationship with John Proctor, a married man. Whether real or imagined, that drama helped spark a deadly game of "she hexed me, she tempted me, she whispered in my dreams." 17 people were executed, most of them women. Their real crime: being inconvenient, non-compliant, or too visible. And it wasn't just Salem. In Scotland, more than 4,000 people, mostly women, were tried for witchcraft between the 16th and 18th centuries. Many of them were accused after being connected, however loosely, to affairs, pregnancies, or unnatural affections. One trial transcript details a woman who was accused because she kissed another woman on the cheek in public. That's all it took. A gesture, a rumour, a secret too tender for daylight. The scholarly debate here is thorny. Some historians argue that romantic entanglements were secondary to broader cultural fears, crop failures, plagues, bad weather. Others say no. The fear of sexual freedom and female autonomy was central to the entire witch panic, because every society has its shadow self, and during the witch trials, that shadow wore a dress and knew how to make a love charm. And about those love charms, yeah, they were real. There were entire underground traditions of folk magic centred around love and fertility. Bundles of hair tied with red thread, poppets dressed in the lover's clothes, potions made from nightshade or clover. Some were sweet. Others, let's just say, you wouldn't want to find one buried under your doorstep. These rituals weren't always sinister. Sometimes they were desperate. When your choices were limited to marriage or poverty, you'd try anything to sway a heart. But magic, no matter how gentle, became a crime the second someone regretted it. That herbal tea you gave to the local baker, he drinks it, dreams of you, and wakes up terrified. He tells the priest tells the town. Suddenly your home is ransacked, your hands are tied, and no one remembers the quiet kindness you showed them last spring. Here's the gut punch. In many cases, the accused confessed to witchcraft, not because they were guilty, but because they were tortured, burned, stretched, drowned, starved. And often, they'd confess to the very thing society feared most: sexual autonomy, forbidden love, pleasure outside the script. Not because it was true, but because it was expected. So as your eyes start to drift and the edges of the room go soft, think about this. There was a time when loving too freely, or even being loved too dangerously, could get you killed. When affection, real or imagined, was enough to make someone burn. And in those flames, it wasn't just women who died. It was every quiet, radical act of love that dared to exist outside permission. Still with me? Impressive. Most people tap out when love turns lethal, but you want the whole story. So tonight, we dig even deeper into romance's rotten roots and unearth a holiday soaked in more blood than chocolate, Valentine's Day. Yep, that innocent day of roses, candlelit dinners, and painfully overpriced prix menus actually started with a bang, or more accurately, a beating. Before Cupid and candy hearts took over, this day was all about fertility, sacrifice, and maybe some good old-fashioned nudity. Buckle up. Long before anyone named Valentine started signing cards, the ancient Romans were celebrating something far less PG. It was called Lupercalia, and it took place every February 15th, not the 14th. Think of it as a chaotic mashup of frat party, fertility ritual, and public therapy session. The goal? Purify the city, increase fertility, and naturally pair people off for the season. Because nothing says love like animal blood and random hookups in cold weather. Here's how it worked. First, a group of priests called the Luperci would sacrifice a goat and a dog in a sacred cave, believed to be where the she-wolf Lupa suckled Romulus and Remus, the mythical founders of Rome. The priest would smear the blood on their foreheads, laugh hysterically, this was part of the ceremony, and then wipe it off with wool soaked in milk. Yes, really. From there, they'd cut the goat skin into strips and run through the streets whipping people, especially women. And here's the part that sounds made up but isn't. Women actually lined up for it. The lashes were thought to promote fertility and ease childbirth. So if you were a Roman woman who wanted babies, you'd stand in the cold, wait your turn, and hope a half-naked man in a blood-smeared loincloth would hit you just right with goat leather. Romantic. Then came the matchmaking. Names were drawn from urns, and couples were paired off, sometimes for a night, sometimes for the whole year. It was a fertility festival, sure, but also a chance to shake off societal rules and embrace the chaos of desire. For a culture obsessed with order, Lupercalia was their annual excuse to get weird, and maybe fall in love while they were at it. So where does St. Valentine fit into all this? Enter the Christian era, when early church leaders were scrambling to stamp out pagan traditions. Lupercalia was too popular to ban outright, so instead they repackaged it. Somewhere around the 5th century, Pope Gelasius I declared February 14th St. Valentine's Day. Neat swap, right? Just replace the goat whipping with martyrdom and call it a win for morality. But here's where it gets foggy. Which St. Valentine are we talking about? There were at least 2, and maybe even 3, early Christian martyrs named Valentine. The most popular story involves a Roman priest who secretly married couples against the emperor's orders. Supposedly, Emperor Claudius II had banned marriages because he thought single men made better soldiers. Valentine defied him, performed the ceremonies anyway, and got executed for it. Before dying, legend says he left a note signed "From your Valentine." Heartwarming. Also, probably made up. The weird fringe detail. One of these Valentines was reportedly buried along the Via Flaminia with a flower-crowned skull. That skull still exists today, in a Roman church, inside a glass box, lovingly adorned each year with roses and lace. You know, like a corpse-themed Hallmark display. Now here's where things really take a turn. By the time we hit the Middle Ages, the Valentine's Day we think we know starts to emerge. But it's not about love letters or candy. It's about birds. Yes, birds. People believe that February 14th was the day birds started mating. Chaucer even wrote a poem about it in the 14th century, linking the day with romantic pairing, and once the poets got involved, it was all over. Suddenly, Valentine's Day was about courtship, and like everything we've covered so far, courtship was more about power than passion. By the 15th century, nobles were exchanging valentines, short verses expressing affection, or at least heavily stylized obligation. One of the oldest surviving Valentine notes was sent by the Duke of Orleans to his wife while he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, which honestly sets the tone. Love under duress, literally. But don't get it twisted. Even with its poetic glow-up, Valentine's Day never shed its darker skin entirely. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Valentines were sometimes anonymous, and used to shame or mock people. A failed suitor might send a cruel rhyme. A bitter spouse could slide an insult wrapped in lace under the bedroom door. It wasn't all roses and kisses. It It was also passive aggression with paper doilies, and here's the scholarly debate. How much of modern Valentine's Day actually descends from Lupercalia, and how much is a neat retrofitting of Christian and commercial agendas? Some argue that the connection is overblown, a narrative invented later to add spice to the story. Others point out that patterns of seasonal fertility rituals getting repurposed are pretty consistent throughout history. Whether Valentine's Day is a direct descendant of Lupercalia or just inherited its red-soaked vibe is still up for grabs. What we do know is that once the Industrial Revolution and mass printing took over, Valentine's Day became a business. By the 19th century, companies were mass-producing cards with frilly script and sentimental clichés. The darker origins were whitewashed. Blood and goats. What goats? Now it was cupids and hearts, and if you really loved me, diamonds. But underneath all that sugary gloss, the same old currents kept flowing. Romance as ritual, desire as transaction, love as something to be measured, bought, displayed. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those Roman streets echoing with laughter, the crack of leather, and the sharp smell of sacrifice. Think about the women who stood in line to be struck in the name of fertility. Think about saints, skulls, and prison love notes. Valentine's Day didn't crawl out of a chocolate box. It rose from a pit of blood, lust, and longing. And every card you see now, just another layer on top of the bones. By now you've probably figured out that love in history wasn't so much a tender whisper in the moonlight as it was a political landmine with lipstick on. Tonight, we're diving straight into the polished marble halls of power, where affection was strategy, marriage was currency, and romance was about as real as the unicorns in the royal crest. Welcome to the twisted, glittering world of royal marriages, where no one married for love, everyone married for land, and half the time they didn't even meet their spouse until the vows were already inked. Let's kick things off with a classic, the Habsburgs. This dynasty didn't just marry into power, they monopolised it. Their family motto might as well have been, "Why fight wars when you can marry your enemy's cousins?" At one point they ruled everything from Spain to Austria to the Holy Roman Empire just by arranging a few strategic unions. The family tree, less tree, more pretzel. You had uncles marrying nieces, cousins tying the knot, and by the time poor Charles II of Spain rolled around in the 1600s, his family genes were so looped that he couldn't chew food properly or speak clearly. Why? Because both of his parents were actually uncle and niece. Romantic. The whole point of these royal marriages was to consolidate power, form alliances or squash rebellions, not to ride off into the sunset. The bride and groom were often teenagers, children, or even infants when their fates were sealed by treaty. Imagine being 6 years old and already betrothed to someone 2 countries away who you've never met. But hey, your parents really wanted access to their navy. Take Catherine of Aragon, for example. She married Henry VIII of England, but before that she was married to his brother Arthur. Arthur died young, and Catherine was kept in England like a pawn no one was quite sure what to do with, until Henry claimed her for himself. That match would eventually implode in spectacular fashion, with Henry divorcing her to marry Anne Boleyn, and kick-starting the entire English Reformation, just to get a male heir. Love? Nah. He wanted a son. Catherine, bless her, gave him a daughter, Mary, who later burned Protestants at the stake. Family goals. And then there's poor Anne of Cleves, wife number 4 in Henry's endless parade of regret. Their marriage was arranged based on a flattering portrait. When she showed up in person, Henry reportedly recoiled and called her a Flanders mare. He annulled the marriage after 6 months. To her credit, Anne survived the whole ordeal, got a pension, and never had to sleep with him. A win, honestly. Here's your fringe fact. Royal marriage negotiations often involve diplomatic gift exchanges, and yes, this included live animals, chunks of treasure, and in one case, a preserved human heart. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married the future King of France, part of her dowry included land so vast it made the French crown nervous for centuries. That's how powerful a bride's hand could be, never mind the person attached to it. But let's get real for a second. While these marriages were dressed up in gold and velvet, underneath they were built on exploitation. Young girls were treated like bargaining chips. Consent was optional. Feelings didn't matter. Your marriage could bind or break empires, and no one cared if you liked the smell of your spouse's breath. That brings us to the infamous Marie Antoinette, who was married off to the future Louis XVI of France when she was just 14. She arrived in a foreign country, stripped of everything Austrian, including her clothes, and was expected to bear heirs immediately. But Louis was awkward, disinterested, and allegedly unable to consummate the marriage for years. Meanwhile, the court gossiped. Rumours flew. Marie Antoinette became a scapegoat for French anger, and by the time the guillotine dropped, no one remembered that she hadn't chosen any of it. And then there's the debate. Did any of these royal couples ever fall in love for real? Some historians say yes. A few rare cases, like Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, were genuinely affectionate, though even they were first cousins because why break tradition? Others insist that most of these relationships were cold, transactional, and riddled with mistresses, scandals, and passive-aggressive gift-giving. One romantic exception often cited is Peter the Great of Russia and his second wife, Catherine I. She started out as a servant and somehow, through sheer force of presence, ended up empress. Their relationship was passionate, tumultuous, and oddly loyal, even with all the political mess around them. But again, she also had to survive plagues, uprisings, and multiple assassination plots just to be taken seriously. Nothing says, "I love you," like political purges. The thing is, royal marriage wasn't about people, it was about maps. Every time a prince married a princess, a new alliance was drawn, borders were redrawn, enemies became in-laws, and if love did happen to bloom in the middle of that, bonus. But nobody was holding their breath. Even today you can see the leftovers of this system. Royal weddings still draw global attention, mostly because we love the fantasy, the gowns, the pomp, the pageantry. But behind every crown is a long, crumbling trail of broken hearts and unwanted unions. The fairy tale is built on centuries of real people, forced to smile for portraits, while their personal happiness was signed away on parchment. So tonight, before sleep wraps around you like a velvet cloak, picture a royal bride on horseback, riding through the rain to meet a man she's never seen. Imagine the weight of her gown, the ache in her spine, the whispered instructions to look pleased. This is love, history style, a chess match played with vows and veils where the heart rarely got a turn. At this point, you may be wondering if there's any version of a love in history that wasn't manipulated, arranged, or outright poisonous, and honestly, it's not looking great. But don't get too comfortable. We're not done unpeeling this rotten onion. Tonight, we're turning down the lights and stepping into the real-life shadows behind the most famous fictional couple of all time. You know them. You've probably rolled your eyes at them. Romeo and Juliet, the blueprint for tragic teenage obsession. Except, here's the twist. Shakespeare didn't invent that story. He borrowed it. From reality. And if you think the fictional version was dramatic, wait until you meet the real people who may have inspired it. Let's start with what we know. Romeo and Juliet hit the Elizabethan stage around 1597, but the story was already centuries old by then. Versions had floated through Europe under different names, tragical histories, novellas, poems, always centred on two young lovers caught between feuding families. But dig deeper, and you find something eerily close to the play right in the heart of Italy. Welcome to 14th century Verona. Yes, the actual Verona, sun-drenched, filled with nobles, and simmering with rivalry. There were indeed two powerful families, the Montecchi and the Cappelletti, who were on such bad terms that they made the local chronicles for their violent clashes. Sound familiar? Scholars still argue whether those names directly inspired the Montagues and Capulets, or if it's just a poetic coincidence. But here's what raises eyebrows. In 1303, a young woman named Lucietta Cappelletti was rumoured to have died tragically after a forbidden love affair with a Montecchi boy. Details are sparse, no suicide pact, no secret marriage. But the bones of the story are there. Young love, family feuds, death. Over time, that tale picked up steam, getting rewritten with more blood, more drama, more flair. By the time Italian writer Matteo Bandello got to it in the 1550s, the couple had names closer to the ones we know. He cranked the heartbreak to 11, adding miscommunication, fake death potions, and the infamous double suicide. Shakespeare got his hands on an English version of Bandello's story, probably thought, oh, this is deliciously bleak, and gave us the play we all pretended to understand in high school. But let's pause and talk about the real tragedy here. How this story became shorthand for romance. Because if you actually break it down, Romeo and Juliet knew each other for less than a week. They meet at a party, fall in love at first glance, get married in secret the next day, and then, well, you know how it ends. It's not a love story. It's a cautionary tale about impulsive teenagers with swords and zero communication skills. And yet, for centuries, this narrative got wrapped in silk and held up as the gold standard of passion. Think about that. The most iconic romance in Western literature is about two hormonal kids who make a series of catastrophically bad decisions because the adults around them are stuck in their pride. What's even weirder is how many real-life couples have tried to emulate it. There's your fringe fact. Juliet's house is a real place in Verona. Well, kind of. The house dates back to the 13th century, and in the 20th century, the city of Verona decided to embrace the legend fully. They dubbed it Casa di Giulietta, built a fake balcony, and let tourists flood in. Today, people from around the world leave love notes and letters to Juliet on the walls, asking for advice, blessings, or just hoping her ghost might fix their love life. There's even a team of volunteers, the Juliet Club, who answer these letters. So yes, a fictional teenage girl who died from poor communication now has a mailroom. The scholarly debate here is fascinating. Some argue that Romeo and Juliet isn't a tragic romance at all, it's satire. That Shakespeare was mocking the melodramatic tropes of courtly love by showing how absurd and dangerous they are when taken literally. Others insist it's a sincere exploration of how love collides with social structures like family, honour and violence. Both views are compelling, but either way, no one walks out of that story saying, now that's a healthy relationship. And let's not forget the layers of control at play. Juliet, like many young noblewomen of her time, had no say in her future. Her father was ready to marry her off to Paris without asking her opinion. Her nurse, supposed to be her confidant, ends up pushing her into obedience. Romeo, for all his declarations of love, kills her cousin the second things get messy. Their love is pure only in the way fire is pure. Fast, hot, and likely to burn everything down. In real historical Verona, young girls were often married off by age 13 or 14. Boys a bit older, but not by much. These weren't just love matches, they were economic deals wrapped in lace. A noble family might offer a daughter to a rival household as a peace offering or as a way to secure favour. Love, if it happened at all, was an afterthought. Which means that for the real Lucietta and her Montecchi lover, if they existed at all, their story wasn't beautiful, it was desperate. And yet, we keep returning to them. We still carve their names into tree trunks. We quote their lines at weddings. We build fake balconies and throw rose petals. Maybe because, deep down, there's something comforting about the idea that two people could love each other enough to defy everything. Even if it ends in death. Maybe because it ends in death. There's something clean about tragic romance. No awkward aging, no fights over money or whose turn it is to do dishes. Just perfect, youthful passion frozen in time. So tonight, as your breathing slows and your body sinks into stillness, think of those star-crossed lovers, not in the glow of poetry, but in the cold quiet of the tomb. Two children, fooled by love, punished by pride, remembered by the world. Not because they were wise, but because they dared. You've made it this far, and you're still cozy. Impressive. Because tonight we're entering a darker, quieter kind of love. One that had to hide under layers of coded language, secret symbols, and constant fear. This is the history they didn't teach you in school. And if they did, they edited out all the good parts. We're talking about forbidden love in the shadows, queer romance across the centuries. And trust me, this isn't some modern twist on history. Queer people have always been here. Loving, longing, losing. The difference? They had to get really, really good at pretending. Let's rewind to ancient Greece for a second, where things were, well, complicated. On one hand, same-sex relationships, particularly between older men and younger boys in the Erastes Eromenos tradition, were widely accepted among the elite. But this wasn't equality. It was structured, often age-based and tangled up in power. Women loving women? That got way less press, though the poet Sappho of Lesbos, yes, that Lesbos, gave us a few precious verses before most of her work was lost, or destroyed. And even then, scholars spent literal centuries debating whether her poems about the beauty of women were just platonic admiration. Sure, and Romeo and Juliet were just roommates. As the centuries rolled on, things got more repressive. By the Middle Ages, any deviation from heterosexual marriage was treated not just as sinful, but criminal. Sodomy laws were widespread, Punishments range from fines to burning, and even rumours of queer behaviour could ruin reputations or end lives. And yet, the love didn't stop. It just went underground. One of the strangest, most touching examples comes from 14th century France, where two women, Johanna and Laurence, were discovered living as a husband and wife in a small village. Johanna had been presenting as a man, calling herself Jean, and no one questioned it until someone got suspicious. When the truth came out, they were put on trial. Shockingly, Johanna avoided execution, but only by claiming she had been compelled by the devil, as if the only reason a woman could love another woman was demonic possession. Still, the fact that they carved out a life together, however briefly, is a quiet rebellion that still echoes. Fast forward to the 18th century, and you've got coded love letters between aristocratic men in powdered wigs, filled with metaphors about flowers and stars. In one letter from a British nobleman to his companion, he writes, "You are the sun to my garden without whom I wither." It sounds innocent until you realise this man never wrote like that to his wife. At all. Here's your fringe fact. In 19th century England, men used green carnations as subtle signals of queerness. Oscar Wilde wore one on his lapel. So did his lovers. It became a kind of silent protest, a floral rebellion. And when Wilde was put on trial for gross indecency in 1895, his love letters were used as evidence. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. His crime? Being in love with another man and daring to say it in ink. Women, meanwhile, had more room to manoeuvre, mostly because society refused to believe they were capable of sexual passion without men involved. Romantic friendships between women were common, and many shared beds, homes, and even gravestones without ever being officially outed. Some relationships were truly platonic, yes, but others burned with secret passion. The 19th century American poet Emily Dickinson wrote hundreds of letters to Susan Gilbert, many of them laced with longing. In one, she says, "Susie, I cannot make my life go without you. It's both tender and tragic because we'll never know the full truth, but that's the pattern, isn't it? The historical record is full of ellipses where the most important part should be, which brings us to the open scholarly debate. How do you prove love in a history that punished it into silence? Historians still argue over whether certain relationships were romantic or platonic, whether those tender letters meant longing or just intense friendship. And in trying so hard to be objective, they often erase the real depth of queer connection. Because when you're forced to hide who you are, every glance, every word, every small act of affection becomes a lifeline, and that doesn't show up neatly in census records, but the silences themselves are telling. Take Boston marriages in the early 1900s, arrangements where two women lived together, financially independent, often for life. They were respected, even admired, as intellectual partnerships. But were they also romantic? Sexual? The evidence is scarce, but the implications linger. Sometimes it's what wasn't said that says the most. Even during times of intense repression, love still found its way. Through poetry, through shared books, through clothing styles, through subtle phrases like, "a friend of Dorothy." These weren't just affectations, they were survival tools, like a secret language passed hand to hand in the dark. And here's the gut punch. In many cultures, queer love wasn't always hidden. Pre-colonial societies across Africa, the Americas and Asia had complex understandings of gender and sexuality, before colonial powers imposed rigid binaries and laws. The two-spirit people among many Native American nations were respected as spiritual leaders. In parts of pre-Islamic Persia, same-sex love poetry was a major literary tradition. The erasure wasn't natural, it was strategic. And the cost of that erasure, generations of people taught to believe their love had no history. But oh, it does. It lives in letters never sent, in diaries with pages torn out, in anonymous graves, and in the faint trail of initials carved into stone. It lives in every coded poem and smuggled glance and whispered promise that managed to survive in a world that wanted it to disappear. So tonight, as you fall into that soft space between waking and dream, imagine this. Two lovers, walking together down a quiet street, hands brushing just briefly, a glance, a smile, a language no one else hears, and for one moment they aren't hiding, for one moment they simply are. By now, love might be starting to feel less like a fairy tale, and more like a trapdoor that keeps opening under people's feet. And if you've been listening close, you've probably noticed the same theme popping up again and again. Power. Because when romance becomes an uneven transaction, it's not love anymore, it's control. And nowhere is that more obvious or more chilling than in the dark world of mail-order brides, a practice that started centuries ago and still hasn't fully gone away. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers on this unsettling history of desperation dressed up as destiny. Picture this, the early days of colonial expansion. Men, European usually, set out to conquer new lands, often encouraged by promises of adventure, profit, and opportunity. But what they didn't pack? Wives. Or anyone, really, who could offer companionship that didn't involve bar fights or cholera. So once they'd set up their ramshackle towns or dusty frontier forts, the loneliness set in. And with it, the letters, the ads, the requests for women. In 17th century New France, modern-day Canada, King Louis XIV sent roughly 800 women known as les filles du roi, the king's daughters, to marry settlers and help populate the colony. They were mostly orphans, poor, or otherwise deemed excess inventory by polite society. The promise was straightforward: a free trip across the Atlantic, a dowry paid by the crown, and a husband waiting on the other side. What wasn't advertised quite as clearly? That the husband might be a grizzled fur trapper with bad teeth and a drinking problem, living in a cabin held together with twine. Still, many women went, and some were lucky. They found kindness, stability, maybe even something close to love. Others weren't so fortunate. There are stories, mostly lost, mostly whispered, of women who were beaten, abandoned, or worse. But the system kept growing. By the 19th century, American frontier towns were flooded with single men, miners, loggers, railroad workers. Again, they looked east for wives. Matrimonial agencies popped up in newspapers, promising sweet, pliable women from struggling cities in exchange for steady men with land. The reality was anything but steady. Some women were catfished with old photos and lies. Others arrived to find they were expected to work as labourers, housekeepers, and childbearers before they'd even unpacked. Here's your fringe fact. In the late 1800s, the US had actual catalogues where you could pick a bride by height, weight, and cooking ability. One even included handwritten endorsements from previous employers or priests. It was the human version of a mail-order mattress, guaranteed to arrive on time and hopefully not returnable. And while some women signed up voluntarily, hoping for a better life, a way out of poverty or just adventure, many others had little real choice. Economic desperation, family pressure, or outright coercion pushed them onto boats and into arms they hadn't chosen. One particularly grim example comes from 20th century Japan, where picture brides were sent to the US to marry Japanese labourers in Hawaii and California. They were matched through photographs, often touched up or years out of date. Many brides arrived to find older, broken men instead of the hopeful husbands they'd been promised. Some fled, others endured. Love was never guaranteed. Safety wasn't either. Which brings us to the debate. Were these women victims of a system or agents of their own fate? Historians argue both. On one hand, you can view the mail-order bride system as a grim survival mechanism, women leveraging what little power they had in a rigged game. On the other, it's hard to ignore the sheer imbalance of it all. The men usually had options, the women didn't. And when love depends entirely on desperation, is it really love? And let's not pretend it's ancient history. Today, there are still international marriage agencies selling the same fantasy under a glossier name. Websites where men, usually from wealthier nations, browse catalogues of women from poorer countries, Ukraine, the Philippines, Colombia, promised as traditional, loyal, family-oriented. It's Tinder meets colonialism with a premium subscription, and it raises the same old questions. Who holds the power? Who gets to choose? And what happens when someone no longer fits the fantasy they were sold as? Some women do find stable lives through these arrangements. They build families, send money home, get educations they never dreamed of. Others get trafficked. Some end up trapped in abusive homes, their visas tied to their spouse, their support networks non-existent. The line between mail-order bride and human commodity gets blurrier the closer you look, and that's the core of this. When love becomes transactional, when it's something you buy, pick, ship, and unwrap, it stops being about connection. It becomes about consumption, control. A woman turned into a product, a man sold a promise, and the gap between those two realities, that's where the heartbreak lives. You won't see this in the Hallmark movies, but it's real, and it stretches across time like an invisible thread, binding together all the women who were promised a new life and handed something else entirely. So tonight, as you slip into dreams, imagine her, the girl on the boat, holding a faded photo, heart clenching with equal parts fear and hope. She's sailing toward a name she can barely pronounce, a future she didn't really choose, and a love that may or may not be waiting. All she knows is there's no way back. You're still with me, still awake, still breathing, still willing to let history ruin whatever lingering notion of love you were holding on to. That's brave. Or maybe a little unhinged, but hey, we've come this far together. So tonight, we're cracking open a bottle of something a little more volatile, the so-called love cures of history. Spoiler alert, they didn't cure anything. Unless you count curing someone of being alive. Because for most of history, the road to beauty, desire, or romantic success was paved in toxic sludge, and people walked it willingly. Let's begin with a classic, arsenic. This delightful poison wasn't just used for knocking off unfaithful spouses, it was also a go-to ingredient for beauty products. Women in the 16th to 19th centuries used tiny doses of arsenic to lighten their skin, create that fashionable deathly pallor, and shrink their pupils to give their eyes that big, doe-eyed effect. Sound romantic? It wasn't. It was slow-motion suicide for the sake of appearing more delicate, more ethereal, more marriageable. The ideal woman looked like she was already halfway into the grave, and many of them were. But arsenic was just the appetizer. Enter Mercury, the real star of the love remedy lineup. Ancient Chinese medicine used it to treat everything from syphilis to low libido. So did the Romans, and later, so did European doctors during the Renaissance and well into the 1800s. Mercury was applied as an ointment or taken as pills or vapours. Yes, vapours. People willingly inhaled mercury because they thought it would help them get their groove back. In reality, it helped them lose their teeth, hair, sanity, and sometimes the ability to walk. Mercury poisoning caused tremors, memory loss, and something politely referred to as madness. Sexy. Still, mercury was considered cutting-edge medicine for lovers. If your partner gave you syphilis, a common parting gift in royal and artistic circles, you were likely slathered in mercury as treatment. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, they used to say, and no, that wasn't just a cheeky pun. It was a literal description of what happened after a fling with the wrong person. The cure was almost as painful and deadly as the disease. And speaking of syphilis, this disease tore through Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. It affected everyone. Kings, cardinals, poets, peasants. It was often passed in brothels in courtly affairs, or through secret liaisons hidden under layers of decorum. And since the disease had visible symptoms, sores, disfigurement, and madness, those who caught it were often publicly humiliated. Yet people still pursued love, still visited lovers, still risked everything. That's the cruel twist. Even when love was literally killing people, they chased it anyway. Here's a fringe fact for you. One 17th century cure for heartbreak involved eating powdered pearls mixed with rosewater. Think about that. You're sobbing over a lover who ghosted you by horse, and your apothecary is like, try crushing up some ocean jewellery and drinking it. You'll feel better. Did it work? No. Was it expensive? Absolutely. And that was part of the appeal. If your pain cost a lot, it must be real pain. But the weirdest, and debatably worst, love cure, lead. Specifically white lead, also known as ceruse. This was another skin whitener, popular in Elizabethan England and beyond. The goal was the same, to look pale, pure, and perfectly unthreatening. Queen Elizabeth I herself was a notorious user, applying thick layers of lead-based makeup that cracked and peeled, giving her that signature mask-like appearance. Underneath, scars, lesions, and skin slowly dying from chemical burns. But again, it was all in service of the aesthetic. Romantic, unreachable, beautiful in the way a ghost is beautiful. And men weren't immune to this madness. They had their own tonics, their own lotions and potions promising virility, charm, and irresistible musk. Some involved rubbing bull testicle powder on their skin. Others swore by crocodile dung, dried lizard, or powdered rhino horn. all thought to increase stamina and make one more attractive. Basically, if it was exotic, smelly or endangered, someone somewhere thought it would get them laid. This brings us to the debate. Were these cures sincere attempts at love, or just another form of social pressure disguised as self-care? Historians argue both. On one hand, the use of toxic substances for beauty and romance shows a desperate belief in alchemy, that love could be chemically created, purchased, or forced. On the other, it reflects a deeper fear, that without these enhancements, you might not be lovable at all. And that fear was well fed by society. Women were told that their worth was in their appearance, that their appearance determined their marriage prospects, and that marriage was their only protection from poverty or disgrace. So if that meant eating crushed pearl, painting your face with poison, or letting a barber bleed you to balance your humours, you did it. Because the alternative was being unloved, and in many eras, being unloved meant being invisible, or worse, being dangerous. One of the saddest parts of this history is how many people probably believed it was working, that they were fixing something broken, that the redness of their cheeks, the brightness of their skin, the strange warmth in their chest after swallowing mercury, it all meant they were getting closer to love, closer to someone noticing, wanting, choosing. But they weren't getting closer, they were just getting sicker. And here's the haunting thing. The obsession with modifying ourselves for love hasn't gone anywhere. We've traded mercury for Botox, lead for fillers, and powdered pearls for collagen powders. We may be more medically advanced, but the fear at the core of it, still alive, still whispering that love has to be earned through transformation. So tonight, as your mind softens and your heart slows, imagine a girl at her mirror in a candlelit room. Her fingers tremble as she applies white paint to her cheeks, already cracking from the night before. She smiles at herself, rehearses a greeting. She believes this will help. She believes this will make someone choose her. She doesn't know that each touch brings her closer to fading away. If you're still here, still curled up with your thoughts heavy and your heart a little unsettled, good. That means it's working. That means the soft blur of history's romantic myths is starting to peel back, revealing the jagged things underneath. Because tonight we're not just talking about love, we're talking about what happens when love turns violent, and how, for centuries, jealousy was treated as a perfectly reasonable excuse to destroy someone, sometimes even literally. Welcome to the world of crimes of passion, those hot-blooded, split-second, morally messy moments that filled courtrooms and cemeteries with the ghosts of what might have been. Because for a very long time, longer than you might think, people could kill in the name of love and walk away with nothing worse than a wagging finger and a slightly awkward dinner party afterward. Let's rewind to the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, where the phrase crime of passion wasn't just poetic, it was legal. A man who murdered his wife after catching her in an affair could often claim le crime passionnel, a temporary madness brought on by betrayal. In France, this was basically seen as understandable. If you burst into a room, saw your partner in bed with someone else, and killed them both, the court might reduce your sentence or even let you off completely. Why? Because male honour had been insulted, and apparently that was worse than two people ending up dead. In England, similar stories played out in Victorian courtrooms, but with lace and moral panic sprinkled on top. One case involved a man named Frederick Baker, who murdered a woman he claimed had led him on. He didn't even try to hide it. The court wrestled not with whether he was guilty, but whether her behaviour had provoked him enough to justify it. She was flirtatious, they said. She smiled too often. Maybe she deserved what she got. That's the pattern, and it's sickeningly consistent. Jealousy didn't just fuel violence, it excused it. The underlying belief was this: romantic betrayal wounds a man's pride so deeply that his response becomes uncontrollable. And in some cultures that belief became law. Here's your fringe fact. As late as 2003, some countries still had legal protections for men who murdered their wives or sisters for reasons of honour. In places like Brazil, Italy, and parts of the Middle East, so-called honour killings were defended on the grounds that sexual misconduct brought shame to the family. What counted as misconduct? Often just being seen with the wrong person, or being seen at all. These weren't crimes committed in the heat of real passion. They were cold, calculated acts dressed up as emotional outbursts. And yet, The legal systems bent over backward to treat them as temporary lapses, as if love gone sour made violence not only understandable, but human. And it wasn't always physical. Emotional manipulation, stalking and sabotage often got the same romantic framing. A jealous suitor tearing apart a woman's reputation wasn't cruel. He was just heartbroken. A man showing up uninvited over and over again wasn't dangerous. He was persistent. In literature, jealousy was romantic tension. In real life, it was a warning. But for centuries, no one wanted to hear the alarm bells. Take Othello, Shakespeare's classic tale of love and jealousy. Spoiler alert, he strangles his wife, Desdemona, because he thinks she's cheating. No proof, just whispers and insecurities. And the audience? They're meant to see it as tragic, inevitable. A good man driven mad by love. Except let's pause and ask, was it love or ownership? Because Othello doesn't just grieve Desdemona's supposed betrayal, he punishes her for it. His heartbreak has rules, and when she breaks them, even only in his imagination, he decides she has to die. That same mindset shows up everywhere, even today. You can find court cases where abusers claim they hit their partner because they just couldn't handle seeing them with someone else. And too often, the headlines still say things like, "Lover's quarrel ends in tragedy," as if the death was just a romantic oopsie. The word crime fades. The word love gets twisted into something unrecognizable. And here's the scholarly debate. Is jealousy a natural, inevitable part of love, or a cultural invention? Some argue that jealousy evolved as a survival mechanism, helping humans protect their reproductive chances and maintain pair bonds. Others believe it's a learned behavior, reinforced by societies that treat partners as property and affection as competition. Either way, the results have been the same. People have used jealousy to justify cruelty for as long as we've written stories. In ancient Rome, men were allowed to kill their wives and their wives' lovers if caught in the act. In some cases, they were expected to. It was seen as proof that the husband was upholding moral order. That's how deeply jealousy was baked into law. Love had rules, and breaking them turned you into fair game. Of course, women didn't get the same leniency. If a woman killed her husband for cheating, she wasn't called passionate. She was called hysterical, evil, ungrateful. The courts didn't ask what she was feeling. They asked what she was wearing, how she behaved, why she didn't just suffer in silence. And if she suspected her husband of cheating and didn't act respectfully enough, that alone could get her killed in some cultures. That's what makes the history of jealousy so dangerous. It pretends to be an emotion, something messy but forgivable. But really it's a weapon, sharpened by pride, justified by culture, passed down like a twisted family heirloom. So tonight, as the world grows quieter and the room gets darker, picture this. A man standing in a courtroom, blood still on his hands, and the jury nodding slowly as he says, "I just couldn't take it. I loved her too much." And someone somewhere calls that love. At this point, you may be starting to wonder if beauty was ever a blessing in history, or just a glittering curse. Tonight we tiptoe into the stories of people who weren't destroyed despite their beauty, but because of it. That thing poets praised, painters immortalized, and romantics still obsess over? Yeah, in real life, it got people exiled, imprisoned, even executed. So if you've ever dreamed of being the fairest of them all, you might want to think again. Because in the archives of the past, beauty wasn't protection. It was bait. Let's start with the cautionary tale of Lucrezia Borgia, a name forever linked with scandal, poison, and incest rumours. But strip away the centuries of gossip, and you find a young woman with an unfortunately symmetrical face and a last name that made her a target. Lucrezia was the daughter of Pope Alexander VI. Yes, Pope, and as such, she was a political tool from the start. Her looks were praised across Europe. Golden hair, delicate features, impossibly pale skin, and those features were used like currency. She was married off at least 3 times, always to further her family's ambitions, and rumours swirled that her beauty was so dangerous it had to be controlled. Some said she carried poison in a ring. Others claimed she had a secret child with her brother. There's little solid evidence for either, but the truth didn't matter. Her face was enough to spark fear, envy, and obsession. She became a living symbol of temptation, and the world punished her accordingly. Beauty, in her case, meant being treated like a weapon someone else could wield. And she's not alone. history is littered with stories of women and men who were loved, worshipped, and then destroyed for the very traits that drew people in. One of the most infamous examples, Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, the original Tudor heartthrob himself. Anne was considered exotic-looking, with dark eyes and a flirtatious manner that captivated the king. She wasn't a conventional beauty, but she had something worse: charisma. And in a court full of arranged smiles and political manoeuvring, that was practically a crime. Anne's rise was meteoric. She dethroned a queen, changed the country's religion, and gave birth to a daughter who would one day become Elizabeth I. But when she failed to produce a male heir, Henry turned on her. Suddenly her beauty became sinister. She was accused of bewitching the king, of sleeping with her brother, of cursing his manhood. The same allure that made her queen now made her dangerous. And in 1536 she was executed on charges most historians agree were fabricated. Her head fell, her story ended, and Henry married wife number 3 just days later. That's the historical equivalent of ghosting someone and moving in with your ex the next morning. Here's a fringe fact. In some parts of Renaissance Europe, laws were proposed to regulate beauty, specifically to keep lower-class women from dressing too fashionably or wearing makeup that might falsely attract noblemen, because apparently looking too good when you weren't born into the right bloodline was a punishable offence. Beauty, it turns out, was something to be policed, not enjoyed. Even outside of court life, being attractive could put a target on your back. During witch trials, women described as tempting, unusually fair, or even just well-groomed, were often among the first to be accused. The logic. If a woman was beautiful and unattached, she had to be using magic, because clearly no one would choose to love her otherwise. It couldn't be charm or confidence or, actual attraction. It had to be sorcery. And this wasn't just a European problem. In imperial China, women whose beauty drew too much attention were sometimes forced into seclusion or punished for causing chaos. One infamous case involves Yang Guifei, the beloved consort of Emperor Xuanzong during the Tang dynasty. Her beauty was legendary, so much so that entire poems were written about the curve of her wrist. But during a political rebellion, court officials blamed her for distracting the emperor. The solution? She was ordered to hang herself. Her beauty had once elevated her above every other woman in the empire. In the end, it signed her death warrant. There's an open scholarly debate here. Is beauty inherently dangerous in history, or is it simply what people used to project their fear and desire onto? Some say beautiful people held more power, and therefore became threats when they stepped out of line. Others argue beauty was never the issue, it was just the excuse. The real problem was always autonomy, especially in women. The moment someone beautiful started making their own choices, that's when the accusation started. And don't assume it was just outsiders doing the punishing. Sometimes it came from lovers themselves. Think of all the stories where jealousy curdles into rage, where men destroy the women they claim to adore because they can't handle the attention she draws. In these tales, love turns possessive. Desire mutates into control. If I can't have you, no one can wasn't just a creepy line from a B-movie. It was a historical mindset, and a fatal one. Even the art world isn't innocent. Beautiful subjects were often painted, sculpted, and then abandoned, or worse, exploited. Simonetta Vespucci, the muse for Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, was known across Renaissance Florence as the ideal of female beauty. But while artists worshipped her face, no one cared much for her inner life. She died young, likely of tuberculosis, and Botticelli requested to be buried at her feet. Romantic? Maybe. Creepy? Also maybe. The irony is that beauty was often seen as divine, something sent by the gods, and yet the world had no idea what to do with it once it showed up. If you were too beautiful, you were a distraction, a threat, a witch, a mistress, a muse, rarely a full person. So tonight, as your breath slows and the room darkens, picture her, the beautiful woman sitting at her vanity, watching her reflection with quiet dread. She knows what they see when they look at her. She knows what they want from her. But she also knows what happens when admiration turns to fear, when the pedestal becomes a pyre. If you've been drifting along this river of ruinous romance, you already know love has never been safe. But tonight, we're stepping into the most delicate, most dangerous terrain of all, love letters. Those sweet handwritten declarations of longing, devotion, and sometimes very bad poetry Yeah, they've also gotten people blackmailed, exiled, and, in more than a few cases, killed. Because for centuries writing down your feelings wasn't just risky, it was lethal paper trail 101. One wrong sentence, and your heart wasn't the only thing at risk of being torn apart. Let's start with the basics. Before texting, DMs, or blurry 2 a.m. voice notes, letters were how people said, "I miss you," or "I want you," or "Please don't marry that guy your father picked." And they weren't just notes. They were confessions, records, traps. A love letter was private, sure, but only as long as the other person kept it that way. And in history, that was a very generous assumption. Take Abélard and Héloïse, the ill-fated lovers of 12th century France. He was a philosopher. She was a brilliant student. Their affair was passionate, scandalous, and utterly doomed. They wrote letters, gorgeous, aching letters, full of philosophy, longing, and way too many receipts. When Héloïse's family discovered the affair, Abélard was attacked by hired thugs and castrated. After that, both were forced into religious life, monk and nun, writing to each other from separate cloisters. Their letters survive to this day, studied in universities, romanticised in literature, and also quietly reminding us that maybe putting your entire soul on parchment during a time of violent social norms wasn't the safest idea. Fast forward to Tudor England, where Mary, Queen of Scots, made the fatal mistake of writing some very flirty, and very incriminating, letters to her lover, Lord Bothwell. The infamous casket letters, as they became known, were supposedly found in a silver casket after Mary was imprisoned. They detailed her desire for Bothwell and hinted at her involvement in her husband's suspicious death. Historians still argue about whether they were forged, edited, or real, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The letters made their rounds in court, and Mary, a queen, was eventually executed. Her words outlived her and buried her. Then there's Oscar Wilde, who fell in love with Lord Alfred Douglas, affectionately called Bosie. Their letters were lyrical and brave, and eventually used against Wilde in his infamous trial for gross indecency in 1895. One of his letters, calling Bosie "my own dear boy," and the love that dare not speak its name, was read aloud in court to gasps and moral outrage. It didn't matter how poetic it was enough to convict him. 2 years of hard labour, reputation destroyed, all because of a letter meant to be private. Fringe fact for you: during the American Civil War, soldiers often carried love letters in their pockets into battle. Some even requested to be buried with them. But in more than a few cases, when they were captured or killed, those letters were read aloud by enemies or printed in newspapers. That sweet line about missing someone's eyes? Now, public knowledge. In a world without encryption, paper was betrayal waiting to happen. And of course, we can't talk about the danger of a love letters without mentioning the petty, vengeful, and highly effective tactic of interception. Kings and queens regularly had their spies read each other's letters to catch affairs, plot coups, or simply shame rivals. One king of France had an entire wing of scribes trained to crack wax seals, copy the letter perfectly, and reseal it so the sender never knew it had been read. It was the 16th century version of hacking someone's email while smiling across the breakfast table. Which brings us to the debate. Were people just hopeless romantics with terrible timing, or did they know the risks and write anyway? Some scholars argue that love letters were acts of emotional defiance, that putting your desire into words was a way of asserting your autonomy, your agency, even when society told you not to feel those things. Others see them as strategic tools, used to seduce, manipulate, or even trap someone into commitment. Because once it was in writing, you had leverage, especially if you were a woman. In many eras, a love letter from a woman could be used to prove immoral conduct, which could lead to annulments, lost dowries, or public disgrace. For men, love letters could serve as evidence in duels. He insulted my sister's virtue in this note. Now he dies at dawn. It was romantic accountability with a blade, and don't forget blackmail. There's a long, sordid tradition of people using old love letters to destroy reputations. In Victorian England, entire cottage industries revolved around intercepting, forging, or selling compromising letters, especially between lovers of different classes, or worse, different races or religions. A single note could be enough to ruin an engagement, an inheritance, or a career. Even when the love was real, the danger remained. One French woman, writing in the 18th century, begged her lover to burn her letters after reading. Every word I write is a rope tightening around my neck, she said. Poetic, also horrifyingly accurate. And here's the twist. We romanticize these letters now. We read them in museums, quote them in weddings, compile them into coffee table books. But when they were written, they were raw, messy, sometimes desperate things, not meant to be studied, meant to be felt, meant to be destroyed probably. But history has a habit of preserving the things we most wish it wouldn't. So tonight, as your eyes flutter shut and your thoughts slow, imagine this. A trembling hand by candlelight, scratching ink onto fragile paper, the heart beating too fast, the hope that this letter will make someone love them, remember them, choose them, and the terror that if the wrong person reads it, everything will burn. We've crept through poisonous love potions, fatal beauty standards, and letters that doubled as death warrants. Now it's time to step into one of the strangest, most unsettling corners of romance history, the courtroom. Because for hundreds of years, lust wasn't just a private matter, it was a legal defence. That's right. People actually stood before judges and claimed that their crimes, sometimes horrific ones, were committed because they were just too in love, or too turned on, or both. And here's the scary part, it sometimes worked. Let's set the scene. Imagine a packed courtroom in 18th century Europe. The air is stale, the judge is powdered, and the defendant, a man of means, maybe a noble or a merchant, stands solemnly in front of the jury. His crime? Murder. But his explanation? He was overwhelmed, driven mad by the sight of a rival kissing the woman he adored, or perhaps, in a particularly strange case, because he had consumed oysters and wine and could not, in good conscience, be expected to act rationally. That was a real thing, by the way. Some men blamed food for their romantic breakdowns, aphrodisiacs gone rogue, and then came the phrase, crime of passion. You've heard it before, probably in a courtroom drama or true crime documentary, where a defense attorney paces dramatically and says their client was temporarily insane due to uncontrollable romantic or sexual desire. But historically, this wasn't just a defense. It was a get-out-of-jail free card, especially if the perpetrator was a man and the victim was a woman he claimed to love. The argument was simple. Passion made him lose control, and therefore his crime, while tragic, was somehow understandable, even forgivable. One of the most disturbing examples comes from early 20th century France, where the legal system frequently downgraded sentences for men who murdered their wives or lovers in fits of jealousy. In 1907, a man killed his fiancée after she called off the wedding. He claimed he was blinded by love. The court agreed. He received a shockingly light sentence. The newspapers called it the sad tale of a broken heart. Never mind that the only thing broken was a woman's skull. But this wasn't just a European problem. In the United States, courts in the 19th and early 20th centuries regularly heard cases where men who committed acts of domestic violence argued that it was the fault of passion. The logic: he loved her too much. And when she cheated, or was merely suspected of cheating, his rage was proof of that love. As if abuse was just love with bad timing. Even more bizarre are the legal cases where sex itself became the alleged cause of criminal behaviour. One man in 1890s England claimed that his long-term mistress had bewitched him through intercourse to the point of moral collapse. He cited her unholy influence in court as the reason he'd embezzled money and abandoned his family. The court reduced his sentence, citing emotional distress. Meanwhile, she was shamed in newspapers as a temptress. It's the classic move. Blame the woman, praise the man's pain. Fringe fact time. In some early American court cases, particularly in Puritan communities, it was possible to use temptation by female attire as a mitigating factor in sexual assault. Yes, you heard that right. A man could claim that he was so overwhelmed by a woman's exposed ankle or overly fitted corset that he couldn't be held entirely responsible for what happened next. The court would nod solemnly, maybe fine him, and then turn around and prosecute the woman for lewd conduct. Because apparently fashion was a gateway drug to sin, this legal double standard became baked into societal norms. Women who cheated, or even appeared to stray, could be publicly punished, even by death. Men, on the other hand, got a sympathy card and a pat on the back if they claimed they just couldn't help themselves. Passion was something noble in men, something dangerous in women. And then there's the truly wild debate. Was any of it real? Was passion ever actually the reason these crimes happened? Or was it just a convenient script handed down by legal culture? Some historians believe that the overcome by lust narrative was a cover for deeper motivations: power, control, revenge. Others argue that, in a world where emotional repression was the norm, people did sometimes snap under the weight of suppressed desire. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but either way the courts were more than happy to play along. It didn't stop with murder either. There were theft cases, fraud cases, even kidnapping cases where men claimed they were so in love they had no other choice. One particularly absurd example involved a Frenchman in the 1800s who stole a carriage and drove it across the country to visit a woman he had met only once. When caught, he burst into tears and said, "My heart was louder than the law." The judge reduced his sentence. Newspapers called it gallant, and of course none of this leniency extended to queer couples. If two men or two women were caught expressing love, or worse, caught breaking laws because of that love, the courts had no tolerance. There was no soft-focused defence about passion or heartbreak, only punishment, harsh, public, and merciless. Even today, echoes of this bizarre legal tradition remain. There are still countries where gay panic is used as a defence. A man claims he reacted violently upon being propositioned by another man, and courts actually consider that a mitigating factor. The old formula remains: some feelings are allowed to override the law, others are criminal by default. So tonight, as the hush of sleep creeps in and your breath slows, picture this: a courtroom lit by flickering lamps, the walls lined with judges, scribes, and spectators. A man weeps, saying he killed for love. A woman stands silent, unable to speak for herself, and the verdict? Still undecided. Because in history, love wasn't just a battlefield. Sometimes it was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. You've seen what happens when love is distorted in courtrooms and twisted into excuses. But what about when love isn't an accident or an outburst, but a plan? A well-dressed betrayal delivered with a smile, a nod, and a signature on a marriage contract. Tonight, we're stepping behind the silks and rituals of arranged marriages, not the harmless parents-know-best versions sold in modern fiction, but the historic ones soaked in manipulation, coercion, and sometimes outright horror. Because for much of history, love wasn't something you found. It was something you were assigned, and backing out. That wasn't just frowned upon. It could cost you your freedom, your family, or your life. Let's start with the basic truth. For thousands of years, marriage wasn't about affection. It was a transaction. You were marrying a dowry, a landholding, a treaty, a business merger with really uncomfortable bedding, especially if you were a woman. Your feelings? Irrelevant. Your future husband's hygiene? Also irrelevant. What mattered was your father shaking hands with another man and agreeing that your womb would now serve his lineage. One of the most haunting examples comes from Imperial Russia, where noble daughters were essentially currency. In the 18th century, the young noblewoman Daria Saltykova was married off at 16 to a man 30 years her senior. Standard practice at the time. When he died, she was left with money, land, and a bottomless fury. She went on to torture and kill dozens of her own serfs over decades, and while her crimes are a horror story of their own, some historians believe the root of her cruelty stemmed from the powerlessness she experienced early in life, being sold into marriage with no say and no escape. Was she a monster? Yes. But she was also made in a system that taught women they had no control except through suffering, or inflicting it. And arranged marriages weren't just among nobility. In 17th and 18th century rural Europe, peasants also made marital deals, usually negotiated by fathers and village elders. If a girl cried on her wedding day, it wasn't from joy. It was often because she was marrying someone twice her age, someone she'd never spoken to, someone who saw her as a walking inheritance. There are countless records of teenage brides begging for the ceremony to be stopped. Some were silenced by force, others ran. The lucky ones disappeared. The unlucky ones were dragged back, married off anyway, and told to smile. Here's a particularly stomach-turning fringe fact. In 14th century England, bride auctions were sometimes used to resolve debt. A father behind on his taxes could offer his daughter in marriage to a man with the right coin. The girl might be 12, she might be terrified, but the exchange was legal, even praised. Communities saw it as practical, a way to stabilize families and redistribute wealth. Her consent, not really part of the discussion. But it gets worse. In many cultures, arranged marriage wasn't just about money, it was about control. Families arranged unions to keep girls from falling for the wrong type of man, or worse, from developing any opinions at all. In some parts of the Ottoman Empire, girls were married off at such a young age that they had to be carried to the ceremony. Their entire adult lives unfolded in the homes of strangers. Their husbands, chosen by fathers who valued obedience above everything else. And the scholarly debate, it's complicated. Some historians argue that arranged marriage systems weren't inherently abusive, that in societies where communal survival mattered more than personal freedom, these unions often provided economic stability, child-rearing support and long-term companionship. And sure, some couples in arranged marriages did grow to love each other, but others were bound by chains no one saw. Emotional neglect, forced pregnancies, cultural silence that told them suffering was just part of being a good wife or husband. Because arranged marriages didn't just happen to women, men too were married off to secure alliances, expand territory, or boost status. Some were forced into unions with women they didn't desire, socially, emotionally, or sexually. Some were expected to ignore their queerness entirely, to produce heirs with women they could barely touch. One 18th century nobleman in Italy wrote in his journal, "She is kind, but she is not who I love. I am grateful, and I am dying." And that's a feeling too many were forced to carry. Then there's the emotional blackmail baked into it. Parents telling their children, "We know what's best." Communities reinforcing the lie that love comes after duty, that suffering is temporary, and that choosing for yourself is selfish. How many people swallowed their voices to keep the peace? How many were told that a parent's reputation mattered more than a lifetime of unhappiness? Of course, some arranged marriages didn't even pretend to offer the illusion of choice. They were outright forced. Girls kidnapped during wars, traded in diplomatic settlements, or sold as collateral. One horrific example. During the 30 Years' War in Europe, entire villages were burned, and surviving girls were distributed to soldiers as wives. These weren't unions. They were punishments with rings. And then there were the corrections. If a woman in an arranged marriage dared to rebel, ran away, refused her husband's touch, or spoke out, she could be locked in a room, sent to a convent, or worse. In some 19th century Indian households, women who displeased their husbands were punished not with divorce, but with social death. They were kept inside for years. No visitors, no books, just silence and slow erasure. And yet, we still romanticize these stories. We watch period dramas with beautiful gowns and candlelit ceremonies and forget what those weddings really meant. We forget that many of the women in those scenes were legally property before they were ever considered partners. That many of them cried on their wedding night not from love, but from fear, from pain, from the knowledge that this was it, this man, this house, this cage. So tonight, as your mind sinks deeper and your pulse slows, imagine her, the bride standing in her wedding gown, too young to understand the words being spoken, too frightened to run. Her hands tremble, her father smiles, her groom grips her wrist a little too tight, and everyone applauds, because in their eyes this is tradition, this is duty, this is love. But you and I both know it isn't. You're still here, still drifting through the shadows of love's ugliest legacies, and tonight we're leaving behind royal halls and powdered wigs and stepping into something even darker. No lace, no letters, just bare, brutal truth. Because for generations, love wasn't just twisted, it was weaponized. Welcome to the horrifying world of the slave bride trade, where romance was a mask and behind it was exploitation dressed as marriage. Forget the idea of romance as we know it. This was about control, economics, power, and people, mostly women, were bought, sold, and married not for love, but as property dressed in veils. Let's start with the obvious. Slavery and marriage have never been cleanly separate. In many societies throughout history, enslaved women were coerced into relationships, sometimes legal, sometimes not, that functioned as marriage in name only. The reality? They had no power to consent. They couldn't say no. They couldn't leave. And yet, records often describe these arrangements in flowery terms, as household unions, as special companionship, sometimes even affection. History loves to rewrite violence when it happens inside a home. In ancient Rome, enslaved women could be granted contubernium. a kind of pseudo-marriage with their masters or other slaves. But it wasn't legally binding, and either party, though mostly the male owner, could dissolve it at any time. If children were born, they were the property of the master. And let's be clear, if an enslaved woman was forced into bed and gave birth, the state didn't call it rape. It called it reproduction. Fast forward to the American South and things get even more grotesque. Enslaved women were often forced into pairings to breed children for their enslavers. Sometimes it was with other enslaved men, sometimes with the slave owners themselves. These forced unions were justified with language like marriage among the quarters, but they were never legally recognised. They couldn't protect each other. They couldn't stop the sale of their spouse or children. And yet, despite the cruelty, people tried to love each other. Real love, fragile and desperate and furious. But the system didn't care. Here's your fringe fact. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the United States, had a long-term relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was likely his deceased wife's half-sister. She was 14 when the relationship began. Jefferson was 44. Historians once called it a romance. Today, we call it what it was. A power imbalance so steep it doesn't qualify as anything near consent. And yet their children were born into slavery. He didn't free all of them in his lifetime. In the Ottoman Empire, enslaved concubines could sometimes be married by their masters and elevated to positions of power. But again, these marriages were less about love and more about strategy. Political, transactional. The harem wasn't just a place of silken secrets. It was a breeding ground for heirs and alliances. And yes, occasionally affection developed. Occasionally an enslaved woman became the mother of a sultan. But none of that changed the core fact. She had no choice in the matter. This system stretched across continents. In China, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, poor families sometimes sold daughters as tongyangqi, child brides or slave brides. These girls would be raised in their future husband's household, supposedly to be groomed into perfect wives. But often they became servants, abused and exploited by the family before they were old enough to marry. Some were rejected and discarded if they displeased their in-laws. Others were married off anyway, whether they wanted to be or not. The line between slave, servant and bride was thin, and often intentionally blurred. In parts of colonial Africa, European men married local women, knowing full well these unions had no legal recognition back in Europe. The women were seen as convenient companions, sexual partners, and labourers. When the men returned home, they often left their wives and children behind, completely unacknowledged. These women were sometimes referred to as country wives, as if geography made the betrayal more palatable. So what did love look like in these arrangements? It's complicated. Sometimes it was real. Two people trapped in the same system, trying to carve out something tender in the middle of ownership and violence. But even when affection bloomed, it was growing in poisoned soil. Because no matter what they felt, the system still held the leash. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how to categorize these relationships. Were they marriages, exploitations, collaborations, survival strategies, all of the above? Historians still wrestle with the language, because the people involved often had none to describe it themselves. Their voices were erased. Their letters, if they existed, were burned. Their pain was passed down through family stories, if it was passed down at all. And in some cases it still happens. Modern-day human trafficking continues this legacy under different names. In parts of the world today, girls are still sold into marriage under the guise of tradition. Brides purchased online, children married off to repay family debt, women coerced into romantic partnerships with the promise of visas or economic security, only to find themselves enslaved in domestic prisons. The slave bride hasn't vanished. She's just wearing different clothes. That's the part no one wants to admit, that even today some people's love stories begin with captivity. That sometimes what looks like a wedding is actually a transaction. That sometimes the ring is a shackle. So as you drift into sleep tonight, your breath slowing, your mind quieting, think of her. The girl standing at the edge of a marriage she didn't choose, wearing a dress someone else picked, smiling because she's been told to. She doesn't know what the night holds, but she knows what she doesn't have. The right to say no. The right to leave. The right to love freely. And somehow in all that silence she still dares to dream of something better. By now, you've probably realised that the line between love and something much darker, control, coercion, obsession, isn't just thin, it's often invisible. Tonight, we take one of our most dangerous turns yet, into the domain of obsessive love. Not the cute kind in rom-coms where someone stares dreamily at your photo and sends you 36 roses. We're talking about the real thing. Historical stories where affection twisted into fixation and love became a kind of madness. Romantic? Hardly. This is sick love. The kind that stares too long, whispers your name when no one's around, and never, ever lets go. Let's start with a man whose entire legacy is wrapped in desperate obsession. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, also known as the Fairy Tale King. Ludwig was crowned in 1864 at the age of 18 and quickly became obsessed with beauty. Not just art and architecture, but people too. Most notably Richard Wagner, the composer. Ludwig idolised Wagner so fiercely that he poured royal funds into building his operas, personally hosted him in the palace, and wrote letters dripping with longing and idealised devotion. The feelings weren't exactly mutual. Wagner mostly tolerated Ludwig's attention to finance his own lifestyle. But Ludwig didn't care. He built entire castles inspired by Wagner's operas, including Neuschwanstein, that dreamy mountaintop fortress that looks like it was plucked straight from a child's imagination. But behind the beauty, a mind unravelling, Ludwig became reclusive, paranoid, obsessed with grandeur. He staged elaborate dinners alone, setting up places for imaginary guests. His advisors declared him insane. He was eventually found dead under mysterious circumstances in a lake, alongside his psychiatrist. Love, unreciprocated, idealised and unhinged, had completely consumed him. But let's not pretend obsession was reserved for lonely kings. In Victorian England, one of the most chilling cases of sick love involved a young woman named Emily Dyer, later known as Amelia Dyer. She started as a nurse and midwife, offering to care for illegitimate children. But she quickly turned her work into something darker. She took in infants for money, often from desperate mothers, and then killed them. Over the years, she murdered dozens, maybe hundreds of babies. Authorities would later argue that she did it partly out of a warped sense of romantic vengeance. She had been abandoned by a lover early in life, and her trust in love had curdled into something monstrous. Her fixation with betrayal and loss turned into violence. When she was finally hanged in 1896, she went silently, but not before telling the police, "You'll know everything soon." A line fit for a Gothic novel, except it was real. And then there's the fringe fact that chills even harder. Post-mortem photography. In the 19th century, especially in Europe and the US, people took photos of their deceased loved ones dressed and posed as if still alive, propped in chairs, arranged in beds, surrounded by flowers. Why? Sometimes it was the only photo ever taken. Other times it was about holding on. Some widowers would frame these photos on their desks, write letters to them, talk to them daily. It was normalised obsession, love that outlived breath, sanity, and sometimes dignity. Of course, literature did its part to romanticise this sickness. Take La Belle Dame sans Merci, a poem by Keats. A knight meets a mysterious, beautiful woman who enchants him, loves him, then vanishes, leaving him wandering alone, love-struck, broken. It's supposed to be tragic, but it's really a warning. When love becomes fixation, it leaves nothing but ruin. And yet we keep treating the knight as the victim, as if it wasn't his own obsession that undid him. There's an entire category of obsessive love that doesn't look violent at first. It just looks like too much. Like Giacomo Casanova, the 18th century Italian adventurer, writer and legendary womanizer. Casanova's journals detailed dozens of romantic conquests, but many weren't as consensual or charming as he made them sound. He became obsessed with women he barely knew, following them across countries, using gifts, lies, and manipulation to break down resistance. We call him a rogue, a lover. But many of his actions today would be called stalking, harassment, a refusal to accept no. And here's the modern parallel: stalking laws didn't even exist in many countries until the late 20th century. For centuries, obsessive love wasn't illegal, it was expected. If someone pursued you relentlessly, it was flattery. If they ruined your reputation with gossip or followed you through cities, it was chalked up to devotion. Some of the world's most romantic stories are just elaborate case studies in unhealthy obsession. This leads to the scholarly debate that still rages on. Where's the line between passion and pathology? Some argue that love itself is a form of temporary insanity, that chemicals flood the brain, judgment disappears, and obsession is a natural if dangerous byproduct. Others insist that obsession is never love, it's love's imposter, a selfish, consuming force that disguises itself as devotion while destroying everything it touches. But in history that line was never clear, and people paid the price. Sometimes obsession ends in murder, sometimes in suicide. One of the most haunting examples is Werder, the character in Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werder. The novel was so emotionally intense, and Werther's unrequited love so tragic, that after its publication, Europe saw a wave of copycat suicides. Young men dressed like Werder, carried pistols like Werder, and died like Werder. That's how seductive obsession can be. It whispers, if you can't have them, you can at least be remembered. So tonight, as the world dims around you, imagine the obsessive lover, not with flowers, but with clenched fists, not outside your window serenading you, but outside your door, waiting. Not in love with you, but with the idea of you. And remember, love, when real, does not devour. It does not stalk. It does not trap. But obsession wears love's face and smiles when it breaks the mirror. We've wandered through the madness of obsession, watched love rot into control, and seen passion used as a weapon in court. But tonight, the story sharpens. Tonight, romance gets violent in the most literal way. Picture this. A dewy meadow at dawn, two men in tailored coats standing 15 paces apart, each holding a pistol. Their seconds stand by with grim expressions. A dropped glove, a whispered insult, a woman's name spoken too loudly at a ball, and now someone might die for it. Welcome to the world of duels over damsels, where wounded pride dressed up as chivalry, and love was just the excuse. Let's get one thing straight. Dueling wasn't about justice. It was about image, about defending a reputation with blood, preferably someone else's. And when it came to love, or at least the appearance of it, that reputation was everything. If a man's wife, sister, or mistress was insulted, or even looked at the wrong way, honour demanded violence. And it wasn't just about protecting her. It was about protecting his claim to her, his property, his prize. Let's take a famous example. The duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr in 1804. You've probably heard the Broadway version, all rhythm and rhyme. But behind the music was a slow-burning hatred fueled by politics. And yes, personal grievances that included insults slung at dinner tables and parties where reputations were on the line. While the duel wasn't officially over a woman, it's worth noting that many of Hamilton's most damaging comments about Burr were made in private gatherings, where the elite mingled and flirted, and reputations could shatter with a whisper. Then there's the story of Évariste Galois, the 19th century French mathematician and political activist. At just 20 years old, Galois was already brilliant, already dangerous to the establishment, and already tangled in a scandalous love triangle. One morning he fought a duel over a woman whose identity remains a mystery. He was shot in the stomach and died the next day. The night before the duel, he had frantically written out all of his mathematical discoveries in a letter, as if he knew he wouldn't survive. Romantic, maybe. Tragic, absolutely. Necessary, not even a little. But dueling over love wasn't always so noble. Sometimes it was ridiculous. In the 18th century, two noblemen in France duelled over who could better recite a poem to a shared mistress. The poem was bad. The duel was worse. Neither man died, but both were wounded, and the woman allegedly left with a third suitor while they were recovering. Honestly, she might be the only hero in this story. And here's your fringe fact. In 1808, two women in Liechtenstein fought a duel, with pistols, over a mutual lover. This is one of the very few recorded female duels in history. The women, both in formal dress, met in a secluded field. One was grazed, the other fainted from stress. The man in question, he reportedly married someone else entirely, so much for all that gallantry. But it wasn't just a European drama. In the American South, dueling was woven into the culture of honour. Southern gentlemen were expected to defend their name, especially when a woman's virtue, or worse, someone else's desire for her, was involved. One man's love was another man's reason to shoot. In one Mississippi case from the 1850s, a man publicly accused another of writing a lewd letter to his wife. They met as was customary at sunrise. One shot fired, one man fell. The letter? It was never confirmed. But the duel was. The blood proved the point, even if the facts didn't. The scholarly debate around duels and love is a complicated one. Were these acts really about affection, or just thin excuses for ego, pride, and male dominance? Some historians argue that duels were theatre, controlled, ritualised expressions of toxic masculinity that masqueraded as chivalry. Others suggest that in a time when courts couldn't always settle personal slights, duels were a twisted form of social regulation. But nearly everyone agrees. Love was almost never the real reason. It was the socially acceptable cover story, a way to make violence sound like virtue. And while dueling was technically illegal in many places, enforcement was half-hearted at best, especially when the duel involved wealthy or well-connected men. If you died, you were mourned. If you won, you were respected. And if you survived but missed your target, you got points for trying, all in the name of defending a woman who often had no say in the matter. Because let's not forget, the women at the centre of these duels, they were mostly silent, rarely asked, rarely defended in ways that mattered. They were turned into symbols, trophies, reasons to kill. Their agency was stripped away while men wrote poems, drew swords, and strutted around pretending they were heroes in some tragic romance. Meanwhile, the woman might have been terrified, or annoyed, or uninterested in both men entirely. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that someone could die because they loved you, or claimed to. That your name, spoken in the wrong tone or passed around the wrong room, could spark a chain of events that ended in blood. And all while society clapped and called it honour. Even worse, some duels were staged just to impress the woman. The goal wasn't even to fight to the death, it was to prove devotion. A performance of pain. One man even shot himself in the arm to show his sincerity after being rejected. She married someone else. He died of infection. Tonight, as your breath slows and the dark folds over your room like velvet, picture this. 2 men standing in a misty field, pistols raised, hearts pounding, not with love, but with pride. Somewhere, a woman listens, waiting. Or maybe she doesn't. Maybe she's already left. Because while they argue over who deserves her, she's just trying to live in a world that never asked her what she wanted. You've made it through poisoned beauty, obsessed lovers, and duelists with bruised egos. But tonight, things get quiet. Not less dark, never that, but haunting in a different way. Because now we're entering the soft-lit corners of literature and legend, where love doesn't erupt or explode, it simply fades out, with one final irreversible choice. Welcome to the romanticization of the ultimate heartbreak, romantic suicide, when the only way to prove love, in story after story, was to die for it. Let's not tiptoe around it. Dying for love has been framed as noble, poetic, even aspirational for centuries. Entire generations were raised on tales where the most passionate lovers didn't ride off into the sunset. They rode straight off a cliff, often hand in hand. The implication was always the same. If your love isn't something you'd die for, is it even real? Let's start with the blueprint for doomed love. Romeo and Juliet. 2 teenagers, 4 days, 6 deaths. Shakespeare's tragedy became the gold standard for star-crossed lovers, but let's not forget, these kids were young, impulsive, and ultimately manipulated by a world that couldn't let them love in peace. And how does it end? A miscommunication, a double suicide, and a vague moral about feuding families. But what generations really took from it was this: real love is worth dying for. And if it doesn't destroy you, maybe it wasn't deep enough. This wasn't just fiction, it shaped reality. In 18th century Germany, the publication of Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther caused such a spike in copycat suicides that some cities banned the book outright. People, especially young men dressed like Werther, copied his melancholy and in chilling numbers followed his fictional example, all because he couldn't be with the woman he loved. One story, tragically beautiful, became a cultural permission slip for despair. It's easy to say these were just stories, but stories teach us how to feel, and when those stories tell you that love should hurt, that heartbreak is fatal, and that the only escape from longing is death, it sets a dangerous standard, especially for people who already feel unseen or unchosen. And it wasn't just Western culture. In Japan, the centuries-old tradition of shinju, lover's suicide, became a revered narrative in both literature and theatre. In bunraku puppet plays and kabuki dramas, young couples unable to be together in life would choose to die together instead, often in carefully staged rituals. Sometimes they tied themselves together before leaping into rivers, sometimes they used matching blades. The audience wept, critics praised the devotion, and real couples followed the script. So many, in fact, that the government tried to ban plays about it, fearing the public was too willing to imitate the art. But the problem wasn't just in the theatre. It was in the belief that love is only meaningful when it's tragic, that suffering makes it real, and death, the ultimate sacrifice, turns it into legend. Here's a lesser-known fringe fact. In Victorian England, women who died of heartbreak were often described in newspapers with poetic flourishes: withered from love, wasted away from longing. Medical records would quietly list tuberculosis or malnutrition, but society preferred the fantasy that she simply couldn't go on without him, as if her life was only valid in the context of someone else's affection. Men weren't exempt either. In some romantic circles, particularly among 19th century artists, dying for love was seen as a kind of aesthetic achievement. Pain was noble, tragedy was chic. There are letters from poets like John Keats and Lord Byron where they casually refer to the idea of dying young and heartbroken as the highest beauty. Imagine that, turning your own death into a performance for people who might never have even loved you back. Of course, not all romantic suicides were mutual. Some were desperate acts after betrayal, abandonment, or social disgrace. In countless historical cases, women who lost their virginity outside marriage, even consensually, were pressured to end their lives rather than live with the shame. The love story becomes a tragedy not because of romance, but because of social cruelty disguised as morality. One wrong kiss, one whispered rumour, and your only way out was a riverbank or a bottle of laudanum. There's a brutal debate here, one that historians and psychologists still wrestle with. Were these suicides genuine acts of devotion, or were they the result of societies that made surviving love impossible? It's tempting to say these people were simply too sensitive, too romantic, too in love. But in reality, many were cornered, rejected by families, mocked by communities, shamed in ways that made life feel unbearable. Suicide wasn't about love, it was about escape. And yet, the myth endured. Romantic suicide was elevated, polished, made into art. Think of opera heroines collapsing dramatically in candlelight. Think of paintings where lovers lie entwined in death, serene and beautiful. Rarely does art show the mess, the panic, the loneliness in those last moments. It shows you the pretty version, the corpse with perfect hair, the love note written in perfect verse, sanitized suffering, curated for consumption. Even in modern media, the trope hasn't vanished. The lovers who can't live without each other, the tragic goodbye, the gunshot timed with the final swell of music. And while we know it's fiction, part of us still absorbs the message: love is serious, dead serious. But here's the thing, no one tells you in these stories. Death doesn't prove love. Living does. Staying through the heartbreak. Choosing to keep going when the person you wanted doesn't want you back. That's the hard part, the heroic part. But it doesn't make for great opera, so we keep clinging to the myth instead. So tonight, as the quiet pulls you deeper and your breath softens in the dark, imagine a balcony under a moonlit sky. Two lovers whisper promises. One of them glances down, thinking maybe love means falling. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe love means staying, surviving, and learning to carry that aching heart in a world that won't stop turning. If you've been feeling a little haunted by all this, good. That means your heart's still intact, maybe a bit sore, but still beating. But tonight, we're going back further, way back, before arranged marriages and duels, before letters and operas, into the hushed world of love magic. That's right, spells, potions, enchantments. Because when love wouldn't come naturally, or wasn't allowed to come at all, people got creative and desperate. And let's just say, history is full of folks who looked at rejection and thought, you know what this needs? Some blood and herbs and a few whispered Latin words. Welcome to the occult chapter of romance, when desire met desperation and love required a little supernatural push. Let's start in ancient Greece, where love magic wasn't fringe, it was mainstream. There were spell books, recipes, and rituals designed specifically to bind someone's affection. One of the most common was the Filtracatadesmos, a binding spell meant to keep a lover faithful, or to force their heart open if it hadn't bloomed yet. Clay tablets etched with curses were buried in graves or nailed to temple walls. The ingredients? Hair, nails, bits of clothing, and sometimes a little animal blood. Just in case the gods needed a nudge. People weren't even subtle about it. If you were lovesick in Athens, you could visit a professional sorcerer. These weren't shady back-alley figures. They were respected, sometimes even feared, for their ability to fix your romantic problems. Can't get the pretty boy to look your way? There's a spell for that. Suspect your wife is wandering? Burn this herb and whisper her name at midnight. Do it wrong, and you might summon nothing, or someone much, much worse. The Romans were even more intense. They had love potions that ranged from harmless wine infusions to full-blown aphrodisiacs, laced with dangerous substances like lead or belladonna. One of the more infamous recipes included menstrual blood mixed into food, believed to bind a man's desire permanently. It's as gross as it sounds, but that's how far people would go when love wasn't mutual. If they couldn't charm you, they'd enchant you. Consent. Not part of the spell. And this wasn't just the work of lonely peasant girls. Elite Roman women were known to employ love magic to manipulate marriages and secure political power. Think lace gloves and poison rings. You know, standard date night accessories. In fact, one Roman law specifically banned the use of magical herbs to excite affection or induce desire, which means it was happening a lot. Enough to alarm senators. Imagine your local lawmakers debating the morality of enchanted seduction over lunch. Jump forward to medieval Europe, and love magic takes a turn for the Gothic. Christianity was tightening its grip, and magic of any kind was officially frowned upon. But behind closed doors, it flourished. Herbalists, midwives, and so-called wise women offered everything from lust potions to unfaithfulness cures. Some of the most common spells involved mixing herbs like mandrake, mugwort, or thyme into wines or stews, reciting prayers backwards, or sewing charms into clothing. Did they work? Well, who knows? But if your crush suddenly looked at you differently after dinner, maybe it wasn't just your stew. Here's a delightfully creepy fringe fact. In parts of medieval France, young women were taught to bake love spells into bread. Literally. They'd knead dough while chanting the name of their beloved, often slipping in a few drops of their own saliva, hair, or, yes, blood. The loaf was then fed to the target. If he ate it, legend said he'd never desire another woman again. Realistically, he might just get a parasite. Either way, the intent was clear. By the time we get to the witch trials of the 15th and 16th centuries, love magic becomes a death sentence. Women were burned, drowned, or tortured not for casting dark curses, but for allegedly using herbs to win a man's heart. Love spells were seen as satanic seduction, unnatural manipulation of the divine order. Never mind that most of the accused were poor, widowed, or just too pretty to be innocent. The idea that a woman could control desire even with a handful of dried flowers and whispered words was enough to terrify entire communities. The debate among scholars is intense. Was love magic empowerment or exploitation? On one hand, it gave marginalised people, especially women, agency in a world where romantic choice was often denied to them. A spell could mean freedom, autonomy, even survival. On the other hand, many spells were explicitly coercive. They weren't about mutual affection. They were about ownership, control, forcing someone to love who you wanted, not who they chose. Sound familiar? In West African and Caribbean traditions like Vodou and Obeah, love magic also played a central role. Here, it was deeply intertwined with cultural identity and spirituality. Love spells were used not just to attract lovers, but to protect relationships, heal broken hearts, and even maintain sexual health. But like all magical systems, they were often misrepresented by colonizers, exoticized, demonized, and lumped into horror stories. A ritual meant to keep a husband faithful became, in the mouths of outsiders, a hex. A love charm became dark sorcery. Control the narrative, and you control the fear. Even in Victorian England, where science and logic were supposed to reign, love magic refused to die. Occult societies like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn held rituals that mixed ceremonial magic with romantic intent. You could draw astrological charts to determine compatibility, craft talismans to attract passion, or light specific coloured candles while reciting Latin invocations to Venus. And yes, Some of these people were also doing seances in their drawing rooms while sipping tea, because nothing says I love you like contacting spirits on a Tuesday night. Here's the kicker. Modern love magic hasn't gone anywhere. It's just rebranded. Look online and you'll find spell jars, intention oils, moon rituals for attracting soulmates. People still carry crystals charged with romantic energy, or write the names of their crushes under pillows during full moons. Is it superstition, hope, desperation? Maybe all of the above. But it shows that even now, when we think we've moved on, we're still whispering to the universe, trying to bend it just enough to make someone love us back. So as the candles flicker lower and your breath settles into rhythm with the night, imagine her, alone by the fire, grinding herbs with a slow, deliberate hand. Her voice is soft as she chants. Her heart is louder. She's not evil, she's just tired of waiting, of being ignored, of watching love pass her by. The spell won't make him love her, not really, but it feels like doing something. And in a world that tells her she has no power, that feeling is everything. You've seen love carved into spells, buried in graveyards, and masquerading as honour at gunpoint. But now we're going to shift just slightly. Not to something gentler exactly, but something quieter. Tonight, we're talking about loneliness. Not the poetic kind with foggy windows and sad violins. The historic kind. The forced, strategic, often invisible loneliness that came from being on the wrong side of society's idea of acceptable love. Because for many, especially those whose desires didn't fit into a neat church-approved mould, being in love meant being alone. Let's start with the lives lived in whispers, queer love stories that never made it into the textbooks. Throughout history, same-sex attraction existed everywhere. In temples, royal courts, boarding schools, salons, trenches. But these were not stories with happy endings. They were carefully curated secrets, sometimes only surviving in letters written in coded language, or art filled with symbols meant to be noticed only by those who knew. In Victorian England, men who loved men had two options: hide or be ruined. The most famous example? Oscar Wilde, of course. His relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, Bosie, was intensely romantic, deeply flawed, and ultimately devastating. Wilde's letters to Bosie were passionate, poetic, and, for the time, dangerously explicit. When Bosie's father found out, he accused Wilde of posing as a sodomite. That accusation led to Wilde's arrest, trial, and 2 years of hard labour. The press tore him apart. Society abandoned him. Bosie, under pressure, betrayed him. Wilde died in exile, all because of love that didn't fit the mould. But Wilde wasn't the only one. There were countless others. Artists, poets, soldiers, servants, many of whom lived double lives, married in public, loved in secret, wrote poems for a dear friend that everyone understood but no one mentioned. Loneliness wasn't just part of the experience, it was the experience. Here's your fringe fact. In early 20th century Germany, the first gay rights organisation was founded, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, led by a man named Magnus Hirschfeld. His clinic offered counselling, safe spaces, and even advocated for legal reform. It was a radical act of hope. But when the Nazis rose to power, Hirschfeld's institute was destroyed. His archives, containing some of the earliest documented queer love letters, stories, and testimonies, were burned in the street. Thousands of lives erased from memory. The loneliness of loving the wrong person, reinforced with fire. But it wasn't just queer people who were forced into solitude. Widows, for instance, were expected to live lives of quiet mourning. In many societies, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, a woman whose husband died was supposed to fade gracefully into social invisibility. In India, some widows were subjected to sati, ritual self-immolation on their husband's funeral pyre. Even when that was outlawed, the stigma remained. A widow showing desire, or worse, remarrying, was a scandal. In Victorian England, a widow was expected to wear black for at least 2 years. If she laughed too soon, went to parties, or seemed too cheerful, people whispered. It didn't matter if she'd been in a loveless marriage. Society still believed her new role was to serve as a monument to the man she'd lost. She was now a symbol, not a person. And symbols aren't supposed to want things. Loneliness also haunted those who couldn't marry at all. In medieval Europe, women who refused to marry were sometimes accused of witchcraft. Because why wouldn't a woman want a husband? What could possibly be wrong with her? Spinsters were painted as bitter, jealous, or suspiciously independent. No one ever asked if maybe they were just tired of watching their sisters die in childbirth, or maybe they just wanted to be left alone with their books and garden. Then there were the women locked away for the good of the family. In 17th century Spain, noble families often sent their extra daughters, those without dowries, to convents. Not always out of devotion, but out of convenience. These girls weren't called to God as much as they were parked. Some found comfort in the monastic life. Others found each other. There are records, hidden, half-preserved, of intense, passionate love letters between nuns, emotional, romantic, sometimes physical, but always cloaked in silence. Which brings us to the central debate. Is loneliness the price of forbidden love, or the proof of it? Some argue that love hidden is still love, that two people who find each other, even for a moment, create a connection more real than 1,000 arranged marriages. Others insist that love, when smothered by shame and secrecy, becomes something else entirely, a shadow of love, a wound that never gets to heal. And yet, in all that enforced solitude, there are flickers of beauty, quiet acts of rebellion. One soldier writing to another during World War I, hiding his love in battlefield metaphors. One woman slipping her beloved a pressed flower during Sunday Mass. One man sewing his lover's initials into the lining of his coat. No witnesses, no applause, just love, folded into corners where no one else was allowed to look. Loneliness became a shared language, a kind of love story written in negative space. What couldn't be said, where hands couldn't be held, what letters had to be burned the moment they were read. And if you're still with me, if your breath is beginning to even out and your eyes are getting heavy, picture this: a single candle in a small room. A woman sits at a desk, writing by its light. She finishes the letter, folds it carefully, then locks it away where no one will find it. Not now, maybe not ever. But in that letter are the words she cannot say aloud, the life she cannot live, the love she holds in silence. That silence is history's echo, and it's still ringing. You've walked beside haunted brides and ghosted suitors, watched history hide and twist love into something cruel, controlled, and unspeakable. But now, tonight, we open the door to something stranger still. Stranger and somehow familiar. Because not all love stories have two people in them. Not all heartbreaks involve rejection. Some are born from mirrors, from delusion, from you. Welcome to the disorienting world of narcissistic romance, where history's most dangerous lovers didn't long for connection. They longed for a version of themselves reflected back through someone else's eyes. Let's not pretend this is just about ego. This is about power disguised as passion. It's about the kings, emperors, cult leaders, and charming disasters who wanted partners not as equals, but as adoring proof of their own greatness. Their ideal lover? A mirror that whispered, "You are everything." Let's start with the literal myth. Narcissus, the Greek youth who was so taken by his own reflection in a pool of water that he wasted away, unable to look away. People love to cite this story as vanity at its worst, but the deeper truth? He couldn't love others because he couldn't see them. Only himself, reflected and unreachable. And that's where narcissistic love becomes dangerous. Not just self-obsession, but emotional vampirism. It's seduction with a knife behind the back. Take Napoleon Bonaparte, for instance. His love letters to Josephine are legendary, fiery, needy, obsessive. But if you read closely, they're less about her and more about him. How she made him feel. How her affection validated his genius, his masculinity, his place in history. When she didn't respond the way he expected, he became cold, punitive, distant. He adored her as long as she adored him more. And when he no longer needed her to feed that mirror, he discarded her. Replaced her. Married someone younger and more politically useful. Sound familiar? These relationships weren't anomalies, they were patterns. In Renaissance Italy, wealthy merchant princes like the Medici often fell in love with women they commissioned to paint or sculpt. Idealized muses turned mistresses, but it was never about the real woman. She was just clay for them to mould, a vessel for their taste, their art, their name. Love wasn't affection, it was curation. Here's your fringe fact. King Ludwig I of Bavaria, yes, another Ludwig, what is it with those guys? built a literal hall of beauties, commissioning portraits of dozens of women he deemed exceptionally beautiful. Some were mistresses, some were random peasants or performers. All were painted, framed, and hung like trophies. It was less a tribute to feminine beauty, and more a shrine to his own power to choose, possess, and immortalize desire. He called it art. Others called it soft obsession. You can still visit it today. But narcissistic lovers weren't always kings. Sometimes they were artists, writers, thinkers, people who wrote about love but rarely practiced it. Lord Byron, with his scandalous affairs and moody poetry, was adored across Europe. Women and men chased him like he was a myth made flesh. But Byron, he adored being adored. He used love to feed his persona, then discarded partners like old drafts of a sonnet. Even his most tragic romances seemed staged, like he wanted the heartbreak, just not the responsibility. And this is where the scholarly debate comes in. Were these narcissists truly in love at all? Or were they just addicted to attention, hungry for affirmation and intimacy, but only on their terms? Some psychologists argue that narcissistic lovers don't feel love the way others do. They feel hunger, craving. They chase the experience of love, the rush, the drama, the tears. But the moment it requires compromise or vulnerability, they vanish or turn vicious. In historical marriages, especially among elites, narcissistic patterns were often institutionalized. A nobleman expected his wife to praise him, serve him, make him look good in public. Her inner world, irrelevant. Her affection, assumed. If she resisted, or heaven forbid criticized him, she became a threat to his identity. Some were punished socially, others were locked away, others were killed. History just called it divorce or annulment. The rest of us call it emotional abuse. And yet, these figures are still romanticized. We quote their poetry, watch movies about their lives, we admire their genius, and conveniently ignore the trail of broken partners, weeping muses, and ex-lovers who either disappeared from history or were painted as unstable, hysterical, or simply not enough. There's a reason this pattern persists. Because narcissistic romance at first feels amazing. It's intoxicating to be seen with that much intensity. To be told you're the centre of someone's universe. The flattery, the obsession, the grand gestures. History is full of partners who thought they'd found their soulmate, only to realise they were just the mirror. The moment they needed to be human, messy, sad, complicated, the narcissist shattered. Even more unsettling? Some people learned to mirror back, to become whatever was needed to keep the love flowing. History remembers some of these lovers as loyal, patient, self-sacrificing. But read between the lines, and you see people slowly erasing themselves to keep the narcissist's gaze. One aristocratic woman in 18th century France wrote, "He loves me best when I do not speak." Another in the Ottoman court was praised for adapting herself to the Sultan's moods like water in a vase. Beautiful metaphors for quiet heartbreak. And here's the hardest part. Sometimes we don't see it until it's too late. Because narcissists don't show up with horns and red flags. They show up with charm, wit, passion. The kind of attention that feels cinematic, until it doesn't. Until you realise that the more they love you, the more invisible you become. So as you drift deeper into this slow, velvety darkness, imagine standing in front of a mirror that smiles back at you, whispers your name, tells you you're everything they've ever wanted. You lean in, hoping to be held, but there's no one there, just your reflection, and the echo of someone who never really saw you at all. We've come a long way, haven't we? Through poison and possession, through letters, ghosts, blood-soaked sheets, and candlelit heartbreak. But as we step into this final chapter, let's turn to one of the most haunting truths of all. Love, when used as propaganda, that's right. Tonight we're not just dealing with individual betrayals or twisted romances. We're talking about entire governments, religions and ideologies weaponizing love to control people. Because when you can convince someone that their heart belongs not just to a person, but to a country, a god, or a cause, you've got them. Completely. Let's start with a classic. Rome and the cult of marital virtue. If you were a Roman woman, particularly one of status, your love wasn't yours. It was a public performance. Loving your husband meant honouring the empire. Bearing children wasn't personal, it was patriotic. The most celebrated Roman matrons weren't known for passion, but for submission, loyalty, and sacrifice. The state praised you for your chaste devotion. If you stepped out of a line, even emotionally, you were punished not just by your husband, but by society itself. A bad wife was a national threat. Sound extreme? Let's skip forward to Nazi Germany, where love was literally recruited into war. Under the concept of Lebensborn, a secretive state-run program, selected women were encouraged, or manipulated, into bearing children with SS officers to improve the Aryan race. Love became a eugenics tool. These relationships were dressed up as romantic, heroic, even sacred. In reality, many of the women were exploited. Some were young girls. The children born into an ideology were often raised by the state. This wasn't love. It was manufactured intimacy, staged for a cause that didn't care about their hearts, only their blood. And it wasn't just authoritarian regimes. During World War I and II, love letters became wartime propaganda. Young men were told they were fighting for the women back home. Posters showed angelic wives and sweethearts waving from porches. Romantic loyalty was used to fuel courage and shame. Don't desert. Don't surrender. What would your sweetheart think? The battlefield became an extension of the bedroom. Soldiers weren't just defending their country, they were proving themselves as lovers. Some letters weren't even written by real women. They were fabricated morale tools, passed among troops to keep them emotionally tethered, and in Soviet Russia, love was often considered a distraction, unless it served the party. Romantic relationships were encouraged only if they produced strong workers and loyal citizens. Love poems had to include patriotic themes. If your romance made you forget your duty, it was suspect. If it made you question the system, it was treason. You could be denounced for bourgeois sentimentality, a fancy way of saying you love someone more than the collective. Here's your fringe fact. In 1950s China during the Cultural Revolution, teenage girls were encouraged to write love letters to Chairman Mao. Not metaphorically, actual letters, romantic, adoring, in some cases disturbingly intimate. These young women weren't taught to fall in love with classmates or neighbours. They were taught to fall in love with the leader, with the idea of devotion. Imagine being 15, told your heart belonged not to a person but to an ideology. That's not affection. That's indoctrination with lipstick on. Religions have done it too. In many evangelical traditions, especially in 20th century America, young girls were taught to marry Jesus first. Romantic feelings were redirected into purity pledges, father-daughter dances, and emotional vows of abstinence. The implication? Your first and truest love isn't human, it's divine. Fall in love with a boy and you risk sin. Fall in love with God and you're safe, sweet, holy, loved. But the catch? You're not taught how to build a relationship based on mutual desire. You're taught how to obey. And sometimes that obedience follows you into marriages where love looks a lot like silence and endurance. And then there's nationalism, the ultimate jealous lover. In many countries, dissenters are labelled traitors not just because they criticise, but because they fail to love correctly. To question becomes emotional infidelity. You're not just wrong, you're ungrateful. You don't love your country enough. Loyalty becomes a kind of romance, and betrayal a kind of divorce. Just ask anyone who's been exiled for asking too many questions. Love your flag, love your king, love your God. And don't you dare ask what that love is costing you. There's a scholarly debate here, of course. Is this really love being exploited, or is it just loyalty being misnamed? Is devotion the same as affection? Can passion be real when it's required? Some argue that propaganda simply uses the language of love, but never touches the real thing. Others believe that when you teach people to tether their identity to someone or something, be it a leader, a god, or a nation, it does become love. Twisted, coerced, and dangerous, but real nonetheless. And here's the part that stings. It still happens. Algorithms learn who we love and feed us back versions of ourselves until we fall for brands, causes, influences, even cults of personality. They speak the language of desire. They call you special. They promise they'll never leave. They make you feel seen. Until you start asking questions. Until you fall out of line. So as your breath softens, your body stills, and you float in this final moment of our journey, imagine it. A world where love is everywhere, and none of it is truly yours. You're told who to love, how to love, what that love must produce. Your feelings are real, but they're not private. They've been drafted into service, pressed into uniforms, written onto billboards. And you? You start to wonder if love was ever something you could claim for yourself at all. Okay, you made it. All 30 sections, every bruised inch of history's hidden, snarled-up love stories. From the dirt-streaked wedding altars of medieval Europe to the spell jars buried under floorboards, from the whispered letters passed between exiled lovers to the velvet-lined gallows where romantic crimes came to their poetic ends. And now, here we are, at the edge of it. You're lying there, hopefully warm, hopefully sleepy, and maybe a little emotionally frayed. That's okay. That's part of the point. Because here's the thing no one really tells you. Love has always had a dark side. Not just heartbreak, but deep, cultural scars. Systems designed to twist it, tame it, weaponize it. Sometimes it was cruel out of ignorance, sometimes out of control, and sometimes, let's be honest, it was just people being selfish, scared, or power-hungry, and using the word love as a shield. But even in the worst corners of this long-winding story, you probably noticed something else too. A flicker, a thread, that no matter how many times love got hijacked or buried or poisoned, it still happened. People loved anyway, in convents and war zones and secret letters never meant to be found. They fell for the wrong people. They stayed with the wrong people. They imagined something better. They risked everything just for one quiet moment of being seen. Love survived, not because history made it easy, but because people kept choosing it, even when it hurt, even when it broke them. Maybe especially then. So now, let your thoughts drift back. Think of the girl with ink-stained fingers, writing a letter she'll never send. The boy watching a train disappear with someone he almost told the truth to. The old woman who still keeps her first love's name tucked behind a photograph. Think of all of them. Then let them go. You're not in their story anymore. You're in your own. Sleep well, and if you dream tonight, dream gently.